Arthur's heart jolted at the sound of a familiar, melodic voice. For an instant, he almost believed the massive bear had spoken, but relief washed over him as Ellie, his little sister, peeked out from behind the beast with her usual playful grin. Staggering back in shock, Arthur barely had time to steady himself before Ellie leapt from atop Boo and collided into him, her arms locking around him with unrestrained joy. Warmth surged through him as he returned the embrace, holding her close. He couldn't help but pinch her cheeks with affectionate reproach, silently reminding her that she was far too old to be hurling herself at people this way. Before he could gather his thoughts, two more voices called out his name. Arthur turned, his chest tightening as his mother and father came into view. He froze, uncertain. Guilt and unease weighed heavily on him, keeping his arms rigid at his sides. Yet his parents didn't hesitate. They rushed forward, pulling him into their embrace with overwhelming tenderness, clutching him as though afraid to ever let go. Arthur stood stunned, his breath catching as emotions surged violently within him. He had believed, he wasn't sure what exactly, but he hadn't expected this. His father's firm presence and his mother's unwavering warmth broke through his hesitation, reminding him of who he was. They would never let the fragments of another life erase the son they had raised with such effort and devotion. Tears threatened to spill as Arthur's resistance crumbled. With a trembling heart, he accepted their love, silently vowing that he had yet to repay them for everything they truly deserved. Ellie's bright voice rang out as she eagerly called for her brother's attention, introducing him to the towering mana beast at her side. Arthur's lips curved into a faint smirk as he took in the creature's name, Boo. Yet the momentary amusement stirred a flicker of offense in the beast itself. Boo's massive eyes locked onto Arthur's, an unspoken challenge sparking between them. In an instant, the enormous paw came crashing down, the ground shattering beneath Arthur's feet with the sheer weight of the blow. Meeting the strike head on, Arthur caught the beast's wrist and pulled with firm resolve, forcing Boo down until their gazes aligned at eye level. Ellie only shrugged with an easy smile, her voice light as she explained that the beast was simply testing the strength she had often boasted about. Boo was competitive by nature, and this clash was his way of acknowledging Arthur. Arthur's shock deepened as realization struck. His sister was not merely playing alongside this creature, she was bonded to it. Ellie's radiant pride confirmed it, her youthful confidence shining through as she stood proudly beside Boo. Reynolds' expression softened with admiration for his daughter, while Alice's gentle voice carried the warmth of a mother recognizing herself in her child's courage. Confusion lingered in Arthur's mind, his thoughts racing to piece together how such a bond had even come to be. The answer came from Virion, who revealed that Lord Winsome himself had bestowed Boo upon the family before Arthur's departure to Epheotis. Arthur could scarcely process the idea that Winsome had so casually handed his little sister a beast of such formidable size and power as if gifting her a harmless toy. Reynolds filled in the rest, recalling how Boo had been little more than a child when given to them, though in only 2 years he had grown into the colossal figure now towering beside Ellie. Before the warmth of the moment could stretch further, Alder's measured voice cut through the air, reminding them all that while this reunion was moving, the matters at hand could not be delayed any longer. Arthur's words faltered, but Reynolds gave him a steady nod of reassurance. Alder then explained with calm authority that Arthur's family would be staying here for the time being, a decision made with his best interests in mind. Though Arthur's heart ached, he bowed in acknowledgement, thanking Alder with quiet respect. Before leaving, he reached out to pat Ellie's head gently, promising that he would speak with her again soon. After embracing his family once more, Arthur turned to follow Virion and Alder down the narrow corridor. He cast one last glance back at Boo, who straightened with determination. The great beast vowed to grow stronger so that he could protect Ellie. Ellie only laughed warmly, confident in Boo's devotion, while Arthur lifted a hand in farewell and continued walking forward. At his side, Sylvie stirred with a rare softness, relieved that Arthur's sister would no longer face loneliness. Their steps carried them through a shimmering portal that opened onto an unassuming oak door. Beyond it lay a meeting chamber, a circular table at its center, surrounded by many empty chairs. Only 3 of them occupied the room. Arthur's eyes swept the vacant seats, confusion stirring. He had expected the presence of the rulers, the lances, perhaps even Director Goodsky, yet the chamber remained still. Virion's voice broke the silence, his tone heavy as he explained that Arthur had yet to be brought up to date on much of the war's current state. Cynthia, he revealed, had succumbed to a self-induced slumber, her only means of enduring the effects of the curse that had activated when she revealed crucial intelligence about the Alacrians. Arthur's jaw tightened, frustration igniting in his chest. His hands clenched, but the fury subsided into a heavy sigh as he forced himself to remain composed. With eyes hard and resolute, he demanded to know everything. Arthur spent hours pressing Virion and Alder with question after question, desperate to bridge the gap of nearly 2 years in which he had been left in the dark. Winsome and Wren had shared only what they deemed necessary, leaving him with fragments rather than a full picture. Now, piece by piece, the truth came into focus. According to Virion, the Glader family had directed much of their strength toward the kingdom of Darv, working tirelessly to regain the allegiance of the dwarves. Curtis and Kathleen Glader, much like Tessia, had chosen to seek seek real combat experience, forming a team and throwing themselves into the front lines of battle. Arthur's own family had been relocated to the castle for protection, while the Helsty family had gone elsewhere, with Vincent dedicating his considerable resources to aiding the war effort. A sharp concern rose in Arthur's chest, and he asked whether his father or mother had spoken of joining the war themselves. Varian admitted that Reynold had shown the desire, but he had personally urged him to hold back, at least until Arthur returned, or until Eleanor was older. Relief coursed through Arthur at the thought, and gratitude softened his features. He could not bear to imagine returning only to learn that his father had fallen in battle while he had been away. With that fear pushed aside, Arthur turned his focus to the matter at hand. His gaze hardened as he reminded Varian and Alder that he knew this meeting was not convened simply for the sake of a family reunion. Whatever had brought him here was far more serious enough to be kept even from Tessia, or else Varian would have spoken to him at the camp. Varian shook his head slowly, admitting that while Tessia's ambition and diligence had carried her far, his concern for her safety outweighed everything else. Arthur's expression darkened, but he understood. He saw through the intent clearly and pressed on, outlining his view of the war. Anyone stationed on the front lines was in danger. Though the defensive wall had thus far prevented the Alacrian soldiers and mutated beasts from spilling out of the beast glades, the hidden teleportation gates placed by enemy spies, coupled with their control over mana beasts, created a deadly force that could not be underestimated. Aldir inclined his head in agreement as Arthur's mind pieced the situation together. To him, the Alacrian strategy appeared too straightforward. The beast glades provided an ideal base, with S-class and even SS-class mana beasts under their command, yet the lack of significant breaches was troubling. If the enemy had not managed to pierce through the defenses, it could mean only two things. Either their own forces were overwhelmingly strong, or the Alacrians were deliberately stalling for time. Arthur caught the flicker in Varian's expression and knew his suspicion was correct. Evidence had surfaced to confirm it. Aldir's voice carried a rare weight as he warned Arthur not to shoulder blame for what he was about to reveal. From beneath the table, he produced several items and slid them across. Arthur's eyes narrowed as he studied the images. An abandoned ship, its frame and structure sparking an uneasy familiarity. The sight gnawed at him, for he recognized echoes of something he himself had once envisioned. Aldir confirmed the truth with quiet gravity. The vessel was not Dicathen, but a ship built by the Alacrians, forged using Arthur's very own designs. Fury surged through Arthur as his hand clenched, crumpling the parchment with violent frustration. Before words could leave his lips, the door to the chamber burst open, and an armored soldier stumbled inside, his breath ragged, desperation etched across his face. Varian's sharp command demanded an answer, and the soldier delivered it with a trembling voice. The ships had been sighted, drawing ever closer to the western coast. Arthur's body reacted before thought could catch up. He shot to his feet, urgency tearing through him as he demanded their location. The soldier stammered out the answer, just miles south of Ediston. That was all Arthur needed. Without hesitation, he stormed past the guard, Sylvie leaping to his side, and together they raced through the corridors toward the teleportation gate. Startled workers and guards scattered as they tore past, driven by singular purpose. At last, the towering double iron doors came into view, guarded by two sentries, a man clad in heavy armor and a woman standing watchful at the opposite side. Arthur's voice rang sharp as he demanded the doors be opened, his impatience barely contained. The male guard stepped forward, his stern face unmoved. He explained flatly that no one could enter or leave without the direct authorization of Commander Virion or Lord Aldir. Arthur insisted, his tone clipped with urgency, reminding them that he had just returned with the very men they spoke of. But the guard's expression only hardened, his words carrying a pointed edge as he reminded Arthur that no matter the prestige or bloodline, respect for one's elders was not optional. The female guard's voice softened as she urged caution, reminding Arthur that venturing out alone was dangerous in these times. She began to suggest that he wait for a guardian, but her words broke off into strangled gasps. Both guards collapsed to their knees, their hands clawing desperately at their throats as though invisible hands were crushing them, their faces reddened as they writhed for air. Arthur stepped forward with calm, cold precision, his gaze glinting with dangerous resolve. The weight of his pressure filled the corridor like a suffocating shroud. In a voice as sharp as frost, he warned them that patronizing him would be unwise. The sound of his name cut through the heavy air. Arthur turned to see Alder striding down the hall, his tone carrying unshakable disapproval. That single note of authority was enough to draw the pressure back. The invisible grip released, and both guards collapsed in relief, sucking in desperate lungfuls of air. Aldir's words to them were measured, declaring that Arthur was free to leave if he wished. Then his purple gaze shifted to Arthur, layered with warning. He reminded him not to act recklessly, for if he did, it would reduce Winsome's efforts to nothing but wasted time. Arthur met the look and gave a solemn nod. With composure restored, he turned back to the shaken guards and instructed them to set the gate to Ediston. Meanwhile, far away in the depths of darkness, Cynthia Goodsky drifted within the confines of her own slumber. The space around her was void, save for a single pale beam of light that anchored her in place. Out of the shadows, a deep voice pressed upon her, demanding that she provide every fragment of knowledge she possessed. Another voice emerged, this one thin and rasping, whispering persuasion into the silence. It reminded her of the weight of her knowledge, how it could win the war, how millions of lives could be spared if only she would yield and cooperate. They demanded answers. One melodic voice spoke with chilling sweetness, declaring that even if she died under the curse's after effects, it would not matter. As long as they obtained the knowledge they sought, her purpose would be fulfilled. Cynthia longed to speak, to protest that Alder had lifted the curse, though she knew in the hollow of her heart that danger had never truly left her. Yet her voice betrayed her. Only the torturous ringing pierced her skull, consuming her senses until her vision turned to searing white. For a fleeting moment, the agony lessened, and in its place, a different presence emerged. A familiar figure approached her through the haze. Varian, though younger, his steps steady beside her own. Together they walked a stone path that wound its way toward a field of wilted tulips stretching into the distance. He broke the silence first, his tone reflective as he asked her what she planned to do now that the war was over. He admitted he had known her for many years, some of them as an enemy, others as an ally, but throughout it all, he had always carried the same thought. Cynthia tilted her head with wry amusement, teasing him with a jest about his undying love for her. Varian only laughed, reminding her gently that he was married. She countered with a smirk, pointing out that such ties had never stopped the nobles of humanity. But Varian's reply carried the pride of his race. Elves were loyal, steadfast to their vows. What he had truly meant, he explained, was that she would make a remarkable mentor. He could see her leading the youth of the future, guiding them toward greatness as the head of an academy. The thought seemed sudden to her, yet he spoke with conviction. He urged her to consider becoming a teacher, assuring her that in time she would grow to love it. Cynthia pondered aloud, a playful spark in her voice, imagining what it might be like to open her own academy in Xyrus City, a place she had grown fond of. Varian's eyes lit up at the idea, marveling at the thought of an academy of mages built atop a floating city. The prospect amused him, yet when she suggested they start it together, he laughed heartily, dismissing the notion of having their names forever joined in its title. Perhaps one day he might send his grandchildren or great-grandchildren there, if the school proved worthy of them. Cynthia's tone grew firmer, her playfulness sharpening into resolve. She declared that she would make it real, that Xyrus Academy would one day rise into the greatest institution for mages the world had ever known. Varian's lips curved into a teasing smile as he remarked that Xyrus Academy hardly sounded original for a school in Xyrus City. Cynthia shot back with sharp wit, reminding him that it could hardly bear both their names, and that he should consider it a privilege if any of his descendants were ever admitted. Varian chuckled warmly at her defiance, assuring her that he had only been joking. With light-hearted ceremony, he lifted an invisible glass into the air as if to offer a toast. He wished for the success of Xyrus Academy, and Cynthia echoed the sentiment, her heart quietly anchoring itself to the moment. She had wished then that it would last forever, but regret seeped through her veins like ice as she watched Varian stride ahead of her. If only they had met sooner, perhaps her loyalty to Alakria and the Vritra would not have been so firm. The truth struck her with brutal clarity. Her heart had already wavered. She was no longer wholly theirs to control. Varian's voice carried from a distance, playful and warm, calling her to keep up. Cynthia stepped forward to follow, only for agony to erupt in her chest. The scene around her dimmed, the tulip fields bleeding into crimson as blood welled over her hands. Her body weakened, collapsing further into the abyss, where she swore she heard a child's voice, fragile, apologetic, echoing faintly as her consciousness slipped. Varian was torn from sleep by a scream that split the air. His eyes shot open as he lurched upright from the chair in his study, the echo of the sound still ringing in his ears. A guard appeared at the door, saluting hurriedly and addressing him as commander. Varian demanded an explanation, but the man faltered, admitting that he did not know for certain, only that the scream had come from one floor below. Varian's blood ran cold. His voice caught in his throat as realization struck. There should have been no one on that floor, no one except Cynthia. The guard's eyes widened as he turned and rushed down the stairs. Varian followed close behind, pushing past the armored soldiers who crowded the corridor. Arthur's family stood outside a room, but none of them moved. Their faces were stricken, their gazes fixed upon the sight within. Varian's steps faltered as his eyes followed theirs. His breath caught in his throat. He stumbled closer, each step heavier than the last, unwilling to believe what his senses told him. Cynthia Goodsky lay still upon her bed, her arms resting gently at her sides, as though she were only sleeping. But from her chest jutted a jagged spike of black, glistening with blood. Her blood! Varian's voice broke into a raw, wordless cry as his knees gave way beneath him. The sound tore through the silence, but nothing could drown the anguish that hollowed his chest. Unaware of the tragedy unfolding elsewhere, Arthur emerged from the teleportation gate into a chamber bristling with guards. guards. He stepped down from the platform, Sylvie at his side, only to be seized roughly by the arm. A soldier snarled at him, demanding his purpose in a city stricken by emergency. Arthur's voice was calm, but edged with steel as he told them that Commander Virion had sent him. The soldier sneered, unconvinced, mocking him as a spoiled noble's son trying to play hero. He barked orders to his men, intent on sending Arthur back through the gate. Arthur's patience frayed. Mana flared around him in a chilling surge, freezing the air as Sylvie's body shifted into her true form, a sleek, pitch-black dragon whose presence alone silenced the room. The soldiers recoiled in shock as Arthur's voice thundered with cold resolve. If the doors were not opened, they would make their own. The ceiling above shattered with a roar of blue lightning. Debris rained down as Sylvie's wings unfurled, carrying Arthur upward through the breach. Gasps and screams echoed below, fading quickly as they ascended into the sky. The winter air stung his cheeks, but for a moment, Arthur allowed himself to take in the world stretched beneath him, the jagged peaks crowned in snow, the green plains, the endless ocean sparkling in the distance. It was a fleeting calm, broken as he guided Sylvie southward. They landed atop a vast, snow-laden precipice overlooking Trelmore City and the sea beyond. Arthur dismounted, his curse spilling into the cold air, his voice echoing mockingly back at him. His gaze locked on the horizon, where hundreds of enemy ships glowed against the rising dawn, their black silhouettes carving dread into the waters. Virion's words rang in his mind, words spoken to steady him. He could not blame himself. He had to keep moving forward, not to fight for the past, but to carve out a better future. Arthur clenched his fists, his chest burning with a resolve both heavy and raw. He had never thought of himself as a righteous savior. His fight had always been for the few he held dear, but now, as the fleet pressed closer, he felt a new purpose harden within him. It was no longer just about protection, it was about setting right the wrongs he had unleashed. Gray's voice dropped to a tense whisper as he urged Nico to hurry, his eyes darting nervously over his shoulder in case anyone wandered by. Two boys crouched at a doorstep drew the wrong kind of attention, and Gray knew it. Nico, dark-haired and stubborn, hissed back that he was almost there, his hands working feverishly at the lock with stolen hairpins. Gray's doubt deepened as he watched his friend fumble with the makeshift tools, but Nico persisted, gritting his teeth in frustration. He muttered about how lockpicking was far more difficult than the alleyway thief had made it seem. Then, with a sharp click, the doorknob gave way. Their eyes lit up in shared triumph, and Gray's whisper broke into a hushed cheer. Nico lifted the hairpin like a trophy, his grin wide with pride. Gray shot him a sharp look, his warning quiet but urgent, reminding him not to draw attention with his theatrics. They slipped inside the wooden door, their movements cautious, their footsteps muted against the polished floor. Yet Nico couldn't help but whisper again, reveling in his self-proclaimed superiority as he proclaimed his skill. Gray ignored the boast, his gaze sweeping over the house's interior. Everything was neatly arranged, its owner's care evident in every detail. His unease lingered. He asked again if Nico was certain the owners would be gone. Nico reassured him with confidence, explaining that he had studied the house the week prior. The couple always left at this hour, never to return for at least an hour. There was time enough to snatch what they needed and disappear. Already Nico was rifling through the room, his hands quick to search for anything of value that could be slipped into a bag. Gray exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. Stealing, even from the wealthy, never sat comfortably in his conscience. Yet the orphanage depended on them. They needed the money, and necessity silenced hesitation. Nico gave a firm nod once he was satisfied with the bag's contents, declaring it enough. Gray swung the backpack over his shoulder, and together they slipped into the crowded back streets of the city. Their footsteps blended with those of countless strangers walking the cracked sidewalks, the boys vanishing into the flow of people. Unease lingered in Gray's mind. He questioned whether they should trust the man they were about to meet. Someone willing to buy goods from 12-year-olds was suspicious by nature, but Nico brushed it off with practiced confidence. The man paid in cash, and he never asked questions, so neither would they. Soon Nico gestured toward a shabby door and asked for the bag. Gray handed it over, watching as his friend knocked in a rhythm that sounded rehearsed, almost like a secret code. A few moments later, the door creaked open to reveal a gaunt man in a worn suit. His sharp eyes appraised them with quiet suspicion before landing on Nico. He recognized him instantly, calling him the persistent child, and noted the unfamiliar face at his side. Nico dismissed Gray's presence with ease, insisting he was only there to help carry the merchandise. The old man studied them a moment longer before finally stepping back, instructing them to close the door behind them. A haze of smoke washed over Gray as they entered. The air was thick with the stale scent of tobacco, making the cramped shop feel even smaller. Nico leaned close and whispered that he would handle things, leaving Gray free to look around. Gray gave a small nod, watching his friend disappear into the back of the room with the man, the backpack slung casually over his shoulder. Left alone, Gray wandered quietly among the shelves. Two men sat nearby, lazily puffing smoke into the air, their eyes half focused on the curling swirling trails above them. Gray ignored them, letting his gaze skim over the cluttered rows of books and peculiar gadgets that filled the shop. One worn spine drew his attention. It was a thin, tattered book, its lettering nearly rubbed away with time. From the faint words he could make out, it seemed to be an old manual on Kai. Without thinking, his hand reached for it, fingers brushing over the rough cover. Almost against his will, he flipped through the fragile pages, curiosity tugging him deeper with every turn. Gray nearly jumped out of his skin when Nico's voice broke the silence behind him. His grip tightened on the book as he flinched, stammering that it was nothing. The rangy shopkeeper's gaze shifted toward him, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. He remarked that the book was useless to most. No one could even read it, and it had done nothing but gather dust. If the boy wanted it, he could have it. Suspicion lingered in Gray's expression, but he said nothing more. With quick movements, he tucked the tattered manual into his bag and muttered a quiet thanks before hurrying out with Nico. Once outside, Nico's grin widened as he unzipped his jacket to reveal a wad of wrinkled cash. His confidence glowed as he reminded Gray that everything had gone according to plan. Gray frowned, weaving through the busy street as he muttered that he hardly saw the point of coming along. Nico had handled it all on his own. Nico only chuckled, teasing that Gray had walked away with a free book. And besides, it was more fun with company. Gray cut him off in a low whisper, his tone edged with urgency. They were being followed. He didn't look back, but his gut clenched as he recognized the pair from the shop, the two smokers. Even after two turns through the crowd, they still trailed behind. Nico's expression shifted, his voice dropping as he ordered Gray to follow him. They pushed toward the city's edge, then ducked into a narrow alleyway. With quick movements, they scrambled up a trash can and vaulted over the locked fence. Gray landed lightly on his feet, but Nico stumbled, catching the fence to steady himself before tumbling down with a grunt. They didn't stop. Their legs carried them through the darkened alley, where the stench of rot and vermin clung to the air and towering buildings smothered the light. At last, they ducked behind a heap of trash, pressing low to the ground, hearts racing. In the suffocating stillness, they waited. Nico leaned out for a quick glance, but before Gray could stop him, a mocking voice rang out. A barrel-chested thug stood before them, his grin cruel as he lunged to grab Nico. Gray yanked his friend back just in time, shoving him hard toward safety. His shout echoed in the alley, in order for Nico to run. The man's arm swept through the air with brutal force, the wind of it grazing Gray's face. Gray retreated a step and swung the broken plank he had seized from the ground, slamming it into the thug's ribs. The man staggered, more stunned than hurt, and Gray seized the opening to sprint toward Nico, but his companion, round-bodied and heavy-footed, struck first. With a crushing blow, the second thug knocked Nico to the ground, the air driven from his lungs. Gray's heart lurched, and he shouted at the man, spitting venom to draw his attention. The insult worked. The thug snarled and turned on him, lumbering forward with greedy hands outstretched. Gray's thoughts raced, his eyes scanning frantically for anything that could tip the scales. Then he saw it, a bent iron nail jutting out from the wall. Hope flared, thin but desperate. He skidded to a stop as the two men closed in. His foot struck an empty tin can, sending it spinning across the ground. It clattered hard against one thug's leg, throwing him off balance. The man toppled to one knee, and Gray leapt upon his back, springing upward to snatch the nail from the wall. The rusted iron dug cold into his fingers, crude and rough, but it was a weapon. Gray's breath caught as he caught the thug's reflection in a shallow puddle below. The man's fist came hurtling at him with a guttural taunt, calling him a rat. Gray twisted aside, his body barely slipping past the blow. The opening came in a heartbeat, and he closed the distance with feral instinct. Bam! The nail in his hand drove forward. A sickening give met the iron as it pierced through soft tissue. The thug's face contorted, concentration shattering into shock collapsing into raw agony. His scream tore through the narrow alley as Gray grabbed Nico's arm and pulled him along. Behind them, the surviving thug rushed to his wounded companion's aid, giving the boys the precious seconds they needed to escape. Their feet pounded against the stone, every breath ragged, sweat pouring from their skin as they ran for their lives. When they finally slowed, Nico nudged Gray with a shaky chuckle. His grin betrayed both awe and disbelief. He teased that this was exactly why Gray had come along, because the way he moved back there had been nothing short of spectacular, like one of the kings who fought in legendary duels. Gray, still reeling, admitted he barely knew what he had done. In the heat of the moment, everything around him had slowed, as if time itself had shifted. Nico laughed, recalling another memory, how Gray had once caught a cascade of falling dishes from Pavaya without even looking, comparing the two moments as if they were the same. Gray shot back dryly that catching dishes was hardly the same as fighting for one's life. Nico only waved him off, too tired to argue further, telling him that he would understand soon enough. For now, they had to hurry back before sundown, or risk earning extra chores. They reached the orphanage just before dinner, the weathered two-story house looming like a stern guardian waiting for their return. Nico eased the back door open, wincing at the long creak of the hinges. They slipped inside quietly, keeping the lights off as they crept through the unlit hallway. But just as they neared their rooms, a voice cut through the silence. The headmaster's tone was calm yet unyielding, calling their names from the living room with quiet authority. Fear flickered across both boys' faces. Nico's voice cracked as he called back that they would be there in a second. Gray leaned close, whispering anxiously whether she somehow knew. Nico whispered back with grim honesty that under normal circumstances it would be impossible. But this was the sorceress they were dealing with. They stepped reluctantly into the brightly lit living room, their clothes stained, faces smudged, and hair disheveled. On the couch sat Headmaster Wilbeck, her posture straight and regal as though her back had never known rest. To the children, she was the sorceress, an elderly woman whose authority was matched only by her aura of mystery. Beside her stood a girl their age, with dusty brown hair cascading over her shoulders. Wilbeck's voice carried quiet command as she introduced her. The girl's name was Cecilia. She would be joining them at the orphanage, and it was expected that Nico and Gray would welcome her, guide her, and grow into friends. Arthur's eyes opened suddenly, the transition sharp, as if he had only blinked, yet his chest felt heavy as though he had been sleeping for days. He sat up slowly, memories clinging to him like a weight. Why had this memory returned after so long? The names of Nico and Cecilia pressed against his heart with guilt, reminding him of a life long past. It had been some time since dreams of his former life had come to him so vividly. He remained there in silence, dazed and unmoving, until a knock stirred him from thought. With quiet permission, the door opened, and a man entered. Late 20s, his manner brisk and formal. He conveyed the summons. The meeting place with the Alacrian messenger had been decided, and Commander Virion requested Arthur's presence alongside Lord Aldir. Servant stepped in shortly after, laying out his uniform, boots, and cloak with efficient precision before bowing respectfully. Arthur washed and dressed quickly, his movements mechanical, though his mind still lingered on the past. Sylvie's amused voice broke through his brooding thoughts, her eyes glinting with mischief as she remarked on the young women who had shown interest in him. She teased, wondering if his attention was reserved solely for princesses. Arthur's eyes narrowed in silent warning, reminding her inwardly not to provoke him further, especially here. When he joined Virion and Alder, his appearance was sharp, every detail in place. Virion's eyes swept over him, and the old elf commented dryly that he was dressed rather finely for one heading into war. Arthur's jaw tightened, but he offered no reply. Frustration simmered beneath his composed exterior. Virion's tone lightened as he teased, remarking that he ought to bring picture orbs as a bribe for Tessia. Arthur's frustration showed in the clipped reply that perhaps the old elf should focus on designing more comfortable uniforms instead. Alder cut off the exchange with quiet authority, stepping toward the glowing teleportation gate and declaring it was time to depart. As they walked, Arthur's gaze flickered toward Virion. Outwardly, the elder seemed composed, strong, steady, even playful at times, but Arthur knew the weight he carried. Director Goodsky's death gnawed at him endlessly, and though Arthur's own thoughts were haunted by how the Vritra had managed to reach her, he could not imagine the pain it left behind for Virion. Yet the man held himself firm because he had to. Virion's voice carried over the hum of the gate, reminding Arthur that the Alacrian ships were only a day away from their shores. He asked if Arthur was ready to meet the messenger. Arthur, his eyes narrowing, turned the question back on him. He knew Virion sought the truth of who had killed Cynthia, but Virion answered with a faint smile, urging that for now, their focus should be on returning safely. He added lightly that his granddaughter would kill him if he let anything happen to Arthur. Arthur let out a short laugh, pointing out that Tessia would likely kill him first. Virion's chuckle followed, tempered by resolve. That was all the more reason for both of them to return in one piece. Aldir glanced back at Virion, reminding him it was time. Virion gave a firm nod. Without hesitation, both of them leapt from the cliff's edge. Arthur followed, his body plunging into the open sky before Sylvie transformed beneath him, her wings unfurling in a burst of strength. He landed firmly on her back, gripping her mane as reins as they rode the wind. Memories surged with every blink, scenes he had long buried, resurfacing in the broad light of day as they sped toward the meeting point. Sylvie's concern touched his mind, her voice soft against the turmoil within. She asked if he was all right. Arthur assured her that he was, though he admitted he was still adjusting to the way she called him by name. His hand reached up to scratch her small ears as he spoke. Sylvie, proud and resolute, lifted her snout as she explained that her grandfather had taught her the importance of upholding the dignity of dragons. With regal poise, in her true dragon form, she sauntered beside Arthur as they exited the teleportation gate Aldir had conjured. The dazzling palette of blue and white blurred around Arthur, pulling him deeper into thought. His mind drifted unbidden to Ephiotis, to the day his training had ended. The brusque king of the Asuras had summoned him before his return to Dicathen. That second encounter with Lord Indrath was the moment when another truth had revealed itself, when Arthur realized who Meyer truly was. The elderly Asura who had once healed him and guided him through the secrets of Realm Heart was seated beside the stone-faced Lord Indrath, yet she was no longer the frail woman he remembered. Her face was radiant, youth restored, her lips curved into a knowing grin. Arthur had stood frozen, words stuck in his throat, until Lord Indrath's deep voice summoned him forward. With little more than a gesture, the king of the Asuras introduced her simply as his wife, Meyer. Meyer's eyes warmed as she greeted greeted him once again, her tone light with familiarity. Lord Indrath, however, was blunt, remarking that without her help, Arthur would have been a lost cause. Meyer dismissed the weight of his words with humility, claiming she had only offered him a slight nudge along his path. But it was what came after that lingered like a shadow. Before Arthur's departure, Lord Indrath had invoked his ether ability. Time itself froze, halting Meyer mid-smile, Sylvie mid-breath, the guards mid-step. Only Arthur remained free to move. The overwhelming stillness pressed in as Indrath's gaze bore into him. With that immovable presence, the Asura King offered a single piece of advice, one that carried the weight of both warning and command. He told Arthur it would be wisest to close his heart to the elf princess, and urged him not to take the advice lightly. Varian's voice pulled Arthur back into the present. The old commander announced that they were nearing the meeting point. He admitted he disliked conducting this negotiation without reinforcements. Aldir's answer was firm. Should the messenger act against them, he had every right to intervene. But Varian's frustration seeped through. He spoke of everything the Vritra had done, breeding Asura half-bloods, creating abominations, and now sending ships across the sea. It all felt like some elaborate game orchestrated by Agrona, a plan that must have been unfolding for years. Aldir's voice had been steady as he explained Agrona's role in the war. Bound by restrictions from directly fighting, the Vritra Lord had instead become the hand that moved the pieces across the board, orchestrating every strike and countermove from the shadows. Varian's reply came heavier, burdened by doubt. He asked aloud who was moving the pieces for their side. Aldir's response was sharp and direct. Varian himself was the one leading this war. The old elf let out a weary sigh, his voice thinning with quiet resignation as he admitted that was what he told himself each night. Both of them paused above the clouds, waiting for Arthur and Sylvie to catch up. Aldir advised that the two descend together with them, warning of the dangers below. Sylvie's voice stirred in Arthur's mind, resolute. She would lay low for now, but she refused to remain hidden once the war began. If Arthur was to fight, she would be at his side, carrying him into battle. Arthur gave a firm nod in answer. With a shimmer of light, Sylvie shrank into her white fox form. Arthur's body dropped into freefall, but Aldir swept beneath them, surrounding both Arthur and Sylvie in the protective aura that cloaked Varian. Wrapped in its steady current, they descended together, plunging through the endless white. The clouds gave way to an expanse of open water, stretching infinitely in every direction. It would have been beautiful, an endless horizon of blue, but Arthur's gaze fixed instead on the dark shapes scattered across the ocean to the north. Dozens of ships, the Alacrian fleet, were cutting toward Sapan's shores. Their destination was clear, Atiston, the capital. As they descended, two figures came into view, their outlines sharpening against the platform below. From a distance, they had blended into the stone, but now their pale gray skin and crimson eyes burned unmistakably in Arthur's sight. They were Vritra. The taller of the two sneered, his words dripping with mockery as he welcomed them to their so-called abode. Varian's eyes narrowed, his tone cold as he remarked that they had expected only a messenger. Surely such a role was beneath the two figures who stood before them. The taller of the pair answered with mock grace, his exaggerated smile bending with insincerity. For this meeting, he claimed, they were merely messengers. His companion stepped forward, introducing them both with practiced poise. He named himself Silrit and the other, Uto. His gaze lingered on Aldir as he spoke, acknowledging the Asura by reputation. Retainers, he explained, had heard much of the famed warriors of Epheotis. He asked pointedly whether Aldir would honor the pact and remain a non-combatant. Aldir's voice was steady as he agreed, provided their side upheld the same. Uto's eyes flicked toward Arthur then, his lips curling into a sneer. He admitted he understood why the one-eyed lord and the old elf were present, but confessed surprise at seeing Arthur Leywin himself. His mocking tone pressed like a blade's edge, calling him the boy wonder. Arthur's gaze hardened, his voice sharp as he retorted that the feeling was mutual. He demanded to know what reason the retainers had for revealing themselves here. Uto only smirked wider, insisting that they were nothing more than messengers. He added that they had spared the Dicathen leaders from seizing a lesser underling, one who might otherwise have been captured and tortured for scraps of information. His crimson eyes slanted toward Arthur, searching his face for fear, for anger, as if eager to provoke. Silrit's rebuke was swift, his voice cutting as he snapped Uto's name, but Uto sneered, unfazed, pointing out that Aldir could not touch them anyway. Aldir's response was calm, almost indifferent. He had no desire to strike them, not here. This was not why they had come. He reminded them plainly that they were here for the message, not for empty sparring of words. Silrit inclined his head, his expression smoothing back into formal detachment. He delivered the decree with chilling simplicity. The High Sovereign's command was this: surrender the ruling families, and mercy would be granted to those deemed worthy. Resist, and the army of Alacria would sweep across Dicathen, eradicating every soul without distinction. Varian's composure cracked, his outrage spilling forth as he declared it for what it was: a one-sided ultimatum, not terms. Uto leaned in, his voice dropping into mockery edged with threat. He told them to be thankful they even had a choice. Uto leaned in, his voice dropping into mockery edged with threat. He told them to be thankful they even had a choice. And with a smile sharpened by malice, malice, he promised Varian that should they choose resistance, he himself would take care to be gentle while severing their heads. Silrit cut him short once more, his tone hardening as he reminded his companion that they were not sent here to provoke a fight. Uto's voice oozed with mock civility as he claimed he had meant no provocation, only a friendly warning of the battles ahead. Yet his grin turned perverse as he shifted back toward Varian. His words dripped with malice as he promised that one day they would meet again. When that time came, he vowed to make Varian suffer, forcing him to watch as his granddaughter became his plaything. Arthur's blood ignited. Ignoring Aldir's stern warning, he stepped forward, hand already reaching for the hilt of his blade within his dimension ring. But before he could draw, Varian struck first. His fist blurred through the air and cracked against Uto's jaw with a resounding impact. The retainer's head snapped violently to the side from the force. And then he laughed, a guttural mocking sound that rattled the air as he straightened his neck. His grin widened, dismissing the blow with cruel amusement, calling it little more than a tickle. But Arthur's eyes locked on something else entirely. His horns. Not the size, not the shape, the chip. That small jagged break in Uto's left horn froze Arthur where he stood. It was the same mark Alea had left, the scar of her final desperate battle. The memory slammed into him like a blade through his chest. Images of her broken body, limbs severed, her core shattered, her lifeless form sprawled in crimson, surged into his mind with merciless clarity. Arthur's voice dropped to a rasp of pure venom as he demanded the truth. He asked if it had been Udo, if this was the monster who had taken Alea's life in that dungeon, the one who had butchered her before death claimed her. Uto tilted his head, feigning thought, his lips curled into a smile as he mocked Arthur with cruel indifference. He said that there had been many with their limbs cut away, many who had died screaming, but then his eyes gleamed with recognition. Yes, he remembered her, the pretty little elf, and what if it had been him? His spittle hit the ground as his sneer widened. Arthur's rage swelled, his mouth parting to hurl back a retort, but Varian cut him off, allowing no chance for Arthur to act on his impulse. Arthur drew in a long, steadying breath. Turning from the sneering retainer, he fixed his gaze on Silrit instead. He asked if there was anything more to be said, or if their predictable threats had been the sole reason for their arrival. Silrit's answer was curt. Dicathen would have 2 days to surrender its royal families. If the demand was ignored, their silence would be taken as a refusal, and the Vritra would respond with annihilation. Varian's robe shifted as he smoothed out its folds with deliberate calm. His voice clipped as he ended the exchange. They would see themselves out. Arthur moved with them, but Udo's voice slithered through the air like venom. He spoke of Alea again, mocking her final moments with obscene relish, describing her screams as if they were a memory he savored. The laugh that followed scraped against Arthur's ears like rusted steel. Arthur's pulse hammered, fury roaring through his veins. He stepped forward to the edge of the platform, mana flooding into his palm. Ice, lightning, and wind attributes fused into a thin, translucent beam that hissed with deadly power. With a swift motion, he lashed out. The spell tore through the narrow space between Udo and Silrit, splitting the air with a shriek of energy. It ripped across the ocean beyond, and the sea itself parted beneath its impact, a gaping wound carved into the waves by his fury. Udo's grin only widened. He tilted his head, mockingly impressed, remarking that it was quite the trick for a child. Arthur cut him short, his voice low and seething. He swore that whether or not this war continued, he hoped to meet Uto again. His tone left no doubt what would follow if that moment came. Turning his back on them, Arthur walked away, his boots steady even as the shadowy platform shuddered beneath their feet. Meanwhile, far away, in the suffocating depths of a dungeon, the cavern floor was littered with the mutilated remains of mana beasts. The air reeked of blood and smoke. Vines snaked around those still alive, binding them tightly before Tessia and Angela finished them with swift, merciless spells. Their bodies, one by one, were dragged and heaped into a growing pile. Elsewhere in the cavern, mages worked with precise care, bending over the corpses to harvest what remained of value. Beast cores were pried free from shattered chests, while horns, fangs, and claws were cut away with careful precision. One of the mages barked, his voice sharp with command. His hands guided the extraction with precision as he warned his team to keep the roots of horns and fangs intact. Darvis scowled at the sight, his frustration spilling over. He demanded to know why they were still here, pointing out that aside from the S-ranked beast, the parts of the others were hardly worth the effort compared to their missing cores. For once, Stannard agreed. Without beast cores, there would be no ammunition for his weapon either, but Darvis's suspicion quickly turned elsewhere, grumbling that Arthur's bond must have swallowed far too many cores. He even muttered that Arthur had probably pocketed some himself. Stannard's agreement ended as abruptly as it began. His dry tone returned, dismissing Darvis's claim acclaim with exasperation. Darvis gritted his teeth, glaring at the grotesque heap of monsters piled unnaturally on top of each other. He asked how they had even died like that, half joking if Arthur had stacked them just to show off. Stannard's voice broke in before he could rant further. His explanation was calm, almost clinical. Corrupted beasts did not behave like normal mana beasts. Driven to madness, they likely tore into each other in their frenzy to reach prey, clambering over one another until they collapsed in a heap. Darvis groaned, cutting him off mid-explanation. He muttered that he understood well enough, insisting he wasn't that dumb, and warned Stannard that his endless fun facts would eventually run out. Before Stannard could reply, the ground shuddered. The cavern trembled under their feet, a deep rumble stirring the air. Stannard stiffened, asking sharply if the others had felt it too. Darvis scoffed, claiming it was probably just the beasts toppling over. Tessia's voice carried from the other side of the cavern, asking whether the extraction was nearly finished. Helen answered with weary honesty, explaining that the pace had slowed. With so little worth salvaging, there was little incentive to keep pushing. Adam, leaning casually against the cavern wall, remarked that at least they hadn't been forced to fight as hard as in past raids. Helen gave a small nod, conceding that point with quiet relief. Tessia then turned the conversation forward, asking what came next for them. Helen answered thoughtfully, explaining that she and Adam would return to Xyrus to resupply before moving on toward their next dungeon near Black Bend. Tessia exhaled, weariness edging her voice as she admitted that her team would return to the floating castle until their next assignment. They had been out here longer than anyone expected. Adam gave a short laugh, his easy confidence cutting through the fatigue. He told her not to feel guilty about resting when she could, especially a princess. Tessia managed a small smile, hoping aloud that they might find a moment to relax, even if only briefly. But while the words carried a tone of relief, Helen and Korea's attention was drawn elsewhere, their eyes fixed on a section of the cavern wall lined with thin, unnatural cracks. Helen called out to Durden, asking if he saw it too. Durden's brow furrowed. His voice dropped low, uneasy, as he noted that the composition of the wall there was different. Before anyone could question him further, the wall shattered. The cracks spread in jagged lines until the stone itself gave way, crumbling apart like broken glass. Durden's bellow rang through the cavern, desperate and commanding. He shouted for everyone to run. From the breach, gnolls and orcs poured through, their roars shaking the chamber as they charged straight for the squad. The cavern exploded into chaos. Tessia, Adam, and Helen braced themselves, weapons drawn, as the first wave crashed into them. Helen's voice cut through the din, steady and commanding, ordering the group to fall back. They had to get the others out before the horde swallowed them whole. Steel met flesh, spellfire seared the air, and the cavern became a slaughter. The squad fought tooth and nail, cutting down beast after beast, but mages crumpled under the relentless assault, their screams drowned out by the gnolls' howls. Darvis was meant to be pulling survivors back, but his eyes flicked away at the wrong moment. A gnoll barreled into him, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs and sending him staggering. Tessia's aura flared. The glow of her beast will lit her eyes as thick vines erupted at her command, twisting into a living web that snared the oncoming beasts. In the same instant, Helen's bow sang. Her arrow streaked through the air like a missile, piercing clean through the writhing tangle of trapped enemies. They collapsed in a heap, lifeless. But there was no pause. A gnoll swept in from behind, its weapon crashing down with brutal force. Both Tessia and Helen dove aside just as the strike shattered the ground where they had stood. Dust and shards of stone sprayed across them, the narrow escape leaving Tessia's teeth clenched. In the back of her mind, a thought seared like fire. How had Arthur ever taken down so many of these alone? Darvis, meanwhile, was faltering under the press of another beast. His arms trembled, his grip slipping, his voice broke in desperation, urging his limbs to move, to fight back. And then Caria appeared. With a cry, she drove her gauntleted fists forward. The strike detonated against the beast with crushing force. The blow so sudden and fierce it caught the creature completely off guard. Karia's voice cut through the din, sharp with anger, as she demanded to know what was wrong with Darvis. His face twisted in frustration as he spat back that his arms were still numb, remnants of the punishment Arthur had dealt him before. Tessia's command rang out, her tone leaving no room for argument. She ordered both Karia and Darvis to fall back to the door and take as many soldiers as they could with them. Karia answered immediately, her voice steady with resolve, and together they charged toward the exit. The gnolls were on them instantly, their claws and crude weapons raised as they surged forward. But before they could overwhelm the retreat, Jasmine stepped into their path. Her dual blades blurred in a whirlwind of steel, carving through the horde with blinding speed. Blood sprayed across the cavern walls as she cut the gnolls down, her movements too swift for their eyes to follow. Karia seized the opening, rallying the terrified soldiers and pushing them toward the exit. Her voice carried above the chaos, urging them to hurry, promising they were almost there. Angela and Stannard held the line, shielding the retreat. Angela's wind magic howled like a storm, throwing beasts back as they tried to advance, while Stannard's weapon barked out sharp reports. Felling enemies one by one, Adam hurled himself into the fray, his spear darting like lightning as he jabbed and slashed at the gnolls pressing in. But in his fury, fury, he failed to see the circle closing around him. Dozens of the beasts stalked closer, their snarls rising as they boxed him in. His chest heaved, breath sharp and shallow, as he realized how precarious his position had become. Then the ground erupted. Jagged pillars of stone burst upward, shattering through the ring of gnolls and scattering them in pieces. Adam staggered back, wide-eyed, as Durden stepped into view, his hands still glowing with earthen mana. Adam gasped out his thanks, but Durden's tone was brisk, almost grim. Gratitude could wait. They had far greater threats to face. Another wave of beasts roared and charged, but before they could close in, Tessia's vines lashed outward, weaving a living cage around her comrades. The snarling gnolls slammed uselessly against the barrier, only to be cut down a heartbeat later as a volley of arrows rained from above. Each shaft struck true, dropping the beasts where they stood. Durden's smirk lingered only a moment as he praised Helen's shot. She answered coolly, reminding Adam that he wasn't the only one keeping score. But the brief levity shattered when the corrupted beast broke free of Tessia's vines, roaring as they surged forward once more. Adam's spear flashed, stabbing clean through one beast and tearing free in a spray of blood. Beside him, Helen's bow thrummed relentlessly, arrows slicing through the air to sever heads with unerring precision. Adam gave her a wry smirk, panting through the chaos, and shouted for her to leave some for the rest of them. She answered back sharply that he needed to keep up. Then came a choking sound. Durden's body crumpled to the ground, blood spilling from his mouth as his eyes widened in shock. Adam's roar tore through the cavern. He charged forward, spear clenched tight as a hulking beast raised Durden in its massive claws. With fury burning in his veins, Adam hurled the weapon with brutal strength. The spear punched through the beast's chest, carving a hole straight through its body. The creature collapsed with a guttural cry, releasing Durden. Adam sprinted to him, lifting the larger man onto his shoulder with trembling arms. He urged him to hold on, swearing they had to move, that they couldn't stop here. Helen tried to cover them, hands fumbling as she drew another arrow, but Durden's eyes widened in horror. A beast lunged for her, and she barely managed to block with her bow. Its fangs clamped down, splintering wood, its claws straining toward her throat. Adam's scream ripped through the cavern as he saw another beast barreling at Helen while she struggled with the first. She turned too late, her eyes widening in helpless fear as death closed in. Without hesitation, Adam threw himself between her and the oncoming strike. The beast's claws raked down his back, tearing flesh and bone with a sickening crunch. His howl echoed off the stone walls, a sound so raw it shook even the beasts. Blood erupted, splattering across the cavern in crimson arcs, staining the walls. Tessia, helpless to intervene in time, could only scream, her voice cracking with anguish as she watched Adam fall beneath the crushing weight of sacrifice. As they flew back toward the western shore, Virion spoke little, his focus bent on the mental transmission artifact in his hand. Through it, he coordinated the plans for the public announcement that was to take place the following day. His voice, calm but weary, carried across unseen channels as he set the pieces into motion. Hours later, they emerged from the teleportation gate into the circular chamber of the castle. The silence between them broke when Arthur confronted Virion, his voice edged with disbelief. He asked if the old elf was truly considering the Vritra's offer. Virion's response was quiet, almost pained. No, he would never submit, but he admitted the thought lingered. If there were even the faintest chance the enemy would honor their word, countless innocent lives could be spared. Arthur scoffed, his frustration sharp. It was too great a gamble, too dangerous a cost, to stake not only Virion's life, but his family's, on the hope that monsters would keep their promises. Aldir's voice cut in then, his tone steely. He reminded them both of what the Vritra's rule truly meant. Even Ephiotis would not remain untouched if Agrona succeeded in spreading his half-blooded offspring across 2 continents. In time, the Asuras themselves would become targets. Virion acknowledged this grim truth with a sigh, his shoulders heavy, yet his mind remained on the reaction that awaited him. He confessed he was not looking forward to the protests that would come with his decision. Arthur's surprise pressed further. He asked if Virion intended to tell the people outright. The elder nodded solemnly, his eyes carrying the tired wisdom of years. He said that trust was fragile, laboriously gained, easily lost. If the people were to believe in him as their leader, they needed to know the truth, no matter how bitter. Yet he wondered aloud how they could continue to trust him once they realized he was wagering their lives like pieces in a game of chance. Arthur's voice hardened. If Virion planned on revealing everything, it meant he would also give the people a voice. What if, in their fear, they chose to sacrifice their leaders to spare themselves? Virion's reply carried a conviction born of centuries. The world had passed the age when kings alone decided the fates of their people. This war would consume everyone, and so everyone must choose. The discussion ended there, the weight of it pressing silence between them. Exhausted and dirt-streaked fatigued from the journey, they separated. Arthur made his way toward the living quarters, mind still churning with unease. What made him pause, however, was the sight ahead. Sylvie's voice stirred softly in Arthur's mind, drawing his attention to the courtyard ahead. His eyes followed her gaze and landed on Ellie. She stood beside her massive bond, Boo, her small frame betraying an air of nervousness. A flush colored her cheeks, beads of sweat clinging to her brow as she listened to a blonde-haired boy about her age. Arthur and Sylvie lingered at a distance, curiosity holding them still. The boy spoke with exaggerated bravado, boasting about how he had dismissed the idea of bonding with a mere fire main. He claimed it was far beneath his genius, insisting he required something far greater, something on the level of a world lion like Prince Curtis. His words died abruptly when Boo growled low behind him, the sound rumbling like distant thunder. Undeterred, the boy puffed up his chest further, continuing to boast. But before he could finish, Boo's massive paw hooked him by the collar and lifted him effortlessly from the ground. The boy's words turned into a shrill cry as he was flung across the courtyard, tumbling helplessly through the air. Ellie's cheeks burned crimson as she scolded her bond sharply. Boo could not simply fling away everyone he disliked, she insisted. But her reprimand was half-hearted, her embarrassment clear. Then her eyes shifted and widened. Arthur was walking toward her, a delighted grin spreading across his face as he closed the distance. Ellie abandoned her flustered composure and bolted forward, wrapping her arms tightly around him. Whispers rippled instantly through the watching crowd, heads turning, voices hushed but unmistakably curious. Arthur stiffened slightly, leaning close to his sister to ask why they were all staring. Ellie explained simply with a soft smile that there wasn't a noble in all of Dicathen who didn't know the name Arthur Leywin. Arthur's gaze flicked to Boo then, meeting the beast's eyes with measured gravity. For a brief moment, silence passed between them before Arthur gave him a firm nod of approval. The bear's posture eased, and Arthur extended his hand. Boo's paw met his with surprising gentleness, sealing an unspoken pact. Ellie eyed them suspiciously, questioning how they had grown so close so suddenly. Arthur's grin returned as he quipped that men with common objectives always found a way to bond quickly. Ellie's voice softened, her expression solemn despite the murmurs still rippling through the courtyard. She told Arthur that it was good he had returned because only he could stop them. Confusion furrowed his brow, but when she spoke again, her meaning struck like a blow. Their parents had decided to join the war. Leaving his sister behind, Arthur made his way through the corridors toward his parents' quarters. His stride quickened with each step, urgency rising like a storm inside him. At last, he stood before the door marked with their family's name, his chest heavy, his thoughts churned. Did he even have the right to stop them? Objectively, his parents would be valuable additions to the battlefield. Their strength, their will, could save countless lives. But the image of them standing on the front lines, their lives at constant risk, it was something he could not accept. Selfish though it might be, he wanted them safe, far from the carnage of war. He knocked, the dull thud echoing his unease. From inside came his mother's warm voice, inviting him in. The sight that greeted him pierced his chest. His mother tried to hide her surprise behind a small, weak smile, while his father lowered his gaze, unable to meet Arthur's eyes. A quiet confirmation, it was true. Arthur's voice was low as he spoke, the words carrying both accusation and disbelief. His father acknowledged him first, setting aside the gauntlet and rag in his hands, though he remained seated. His mother added softly that they hadn't expected his return so soon, taking a tentative step toward him. Arthur's tone sharpened. Had they planned to leave without saying anything? His mother denied it, though hesitation lingered in her eyes. She explained they had only wanted to be ready before he returned. Arthur's frustration burned as he reminded them of what they had once agreed. They were supposed to wait until Ellie was older before risking themselves like this. Reynolds' answer was steady, but it offered little comfort. Commander Varian had advised them to remain only until Ellie was older, or until Arthur himself had come back. Arthur's voice was sharp, demanding. He didn't believe they had suddenly chosen to fight simply because he had returned. There had to be another reason. Why now? Reynolds' jaw tightened as he answered. They had received a transmission from Helen. There had been an attack in the dungeon, striking as the soldiers were leaving. Arthur froze, disbelief shattering through him. That couldn't be possible. He had been there himself only the day before. He had cleared the dungeon. He had killed the S-ranked mutant with his own hands. There shouldn't have been anything left, but Reynolds' face said otherwise. His teeth clenched as he revealed the truth. A hidden entrance had been discovered within the walls. More beasts had poured through. The twin horns had stayed behind, buying time for the younger soldiers to escape. But Adam hadn't made it. The words pierced Arthur like ice. His voice faltered, breaking into stammers of denial. It couldn't be true. He had been so certain. There weren't supposed to be any more beasts. Reynolds' voice softened, though it cracked with grief. He told his son there was no way he could have known. The other entrance had been blocked off, the walls concealing the mana signatures within. No one had expected a second battle. Alice stepped in, her eyes glistening. She explained that the twin horns had fought with everything they had to hold back the onslaught, but there had been too many. More lives had been lost than anyone had anticipated. Arthur's chest seized. A realization surged up and dragged him to his feet in panic. Tessia, she had been there too. His voice shook as he asked who else had died. Alice's reply was heavy, uncertain. They didn't know. The transmission had been cut short, only relaying the dire situation and Adam's fate. Nothing more. Arthur's fist clenched so hard his knuckles ached. He forced the words out, raw and trembling. He grieved for Adam, he truly did. But to join the war because of this? To risk themselves in response? Reynolds' reply was firm, his voice steady despite the sorrow behind it. They weren't choosing this path out of guilt. They both knew the risks. A soldier's life was always balanced on the edge of danger. Arthur's temper snapped. His voice rose, filled with desperation. Even so, his parents had every right to fight. He knew that. And maybe it was selfish for him to try and stop them. But wasn't it selfish of them to risk both their lives when it wasn't only unnecessary but reckless? His voice broke as it dropped to a near whisper, the pain in his chest spilling out. Did they not think of Ellie? What would happen to her if they died? What it would do to her? What it would do to him? Alice's reply was steady, though her eyes softened with quiet pain. She admitted it was selfish. They both knew the consequences, not just for themselves, but for Arthur and Ellie as well. Still, she told him not to blame his father. The decision was hers. She was the one who wanted to return, to stand with the twin horns once more. Arthur froze, stunned. His voice broke as he repeated her words back at her. His mother wanted to go to war. Alice met his gaze firmly, her tone unwavering as she confirmed it. Arthur's denial tumbled out in stammers. She couldn't, not her. Reynolds had told him she avoided using magic, that something had happened long ago. Why now? Why this choice? Alice's eyes flicked to Reynolds. His expression fell solemn, his head dipping in acknowledgement. Then she looked back at Arthur, her voice quiet but commanding. She asked him to sit. Arthur obeyed, lowering himself onto the edge of the bed, his eyes never leaving hers as she gathered her thoughts. There was something they had never told him. Alice's voice grew distant as she began. Once the twin horns had counted one more member among them. Her name was Lenza. She had been a bright, promising augmenter, still young but already gaining recognition. Arthur listened as his mother described how Reynolds had first brought her, a timid young woman from Valden City, into the twin horns, and shortly after Lenza had joined. Brash and straightforward, she had meshed perfectly with Alice, balancing her own timid nature. The two had become inseparable. Alice's eyes glazed with memory as she spoke of her friend. Lenza was impossible to forget, spirited enough to keep Reynolds and Adam in line, and even able to coax smiles from Jasmine. Though she had only been with the party for 2 short years, her presence had defined them, until the accident. Alice's hands trembled slightly as she recounted it. The twin horns had grown careless, caught off guard by a pack of stingers. She had done what she could, closing wounds as quickly as possible, and for most it had worked. Reynolds' injuries had healed easily, shallow cuts on arms and legs. But Lenza, her wound had been near her mana core. The venom spread before Alice could stop it. Lenza's core was permanently damaged. She would never again manipulate mana. Alice's voice faltered, thick with regret. She confessed what she had learned too late, that if she had not sealed the wound, if she had waited, a doctor could have extracted the poison. Instead, her haste had stolen from her best friend the one joy she lived for. Lenza had always claimed she wanted to die gloriously in battle, but robbed of her magic, she had no choice but to live in silence, empty of purpose. Until one day, she went alone into a dungeon and never returned. Alice's composure broke, her voice shaking as sobs slipped through. She confessed the guilt she had carried for years, blaming herself for Lenza's death. If she hadn't rushed to heal her, things might have been different. It wasn't some dramatic calamity that had destroyed them. It was something quieter, crueler, slow, and heart-wrenching. They had loved Lenza deeply, and losing her had left wounds that never healed. Since then, Alice admitted, she had been afraid to use her magic for anything more than minor injuries. But her eyes hardened with resolve as she continued. Adam's death might not have mirrored Lenza's, but after everything the twin horns had done for them, she felt it was finally time to stand by their side. More than that, she confessed that it had become unbearable to watch Arthur fight, while she and Reynolds remained behind, safe, waiting for news. Arthur's voice was quiet, his words heavy with dread as he asked the question that had haunted him since Ellie had spoken. What about his sister? What if they didn't come back? Reynolds' hand clamped firmly on Arthur's shoulder, his gaze steady, voice unwavering. He told his son that strength alone never guaranteed survival. Death came when guard slipped, when vigilance waned. That truth applied to Arthur as much as to them. But, Reynolds swore, at least if they fell, they would do so having done their part to give Dicathen a chance. He vowed to protect Alice, to bring her home. Their goal in this war was to return safely to Arthur and Ellie, but Arthur had to do the same. Reynolds' words struck deeper still. They might not have raised Arthur exactly as they thought, not with the shadow of his past life hanging over him, but Ellie knew nothing of that. To her, Arthur was simply her loving brother. Reynolds urged him not to throw his life away for some vague notion of the greater good. Even if they lost this war, there would always be another chance to fight back. The only true defeat came when no one remained to take that chance. Arthur's voice fell to a whisper, a bitter truth slipping out. He muttered that for him, there had been a second chance. Reynolds snapped, cutting him off sharply. He knew what Arthur meant, but this wasn't the time for that. Alice Alice, wiping her tears, gave a small shake of her head. She said it was far too soon to be joking about such things. Before Arthur could reply, a hurried knock jolted them from the tension. The three exchanged quick glances, then Arthur called out for the visitor to enter. The door swung open, and standing in the threshold was Varian. Reynold and Alice immediately rose to their feet, their movements sharp with respect. But Varian raised a hand, his expression softening. For Arthur's parents, there was no need for titles. Simply, Varian would do. Varian's voice carried the weight of both sympathy and duty. He offered his condolences for the Twin Horns' fallen comrade, but then shared the news he had come to deliver. Word had arrived that the surviving soldiers were returning through the gates even now. He had come to collect Arthur, but he was certain the leader of the Twin Horns was among them. He asked softly if Reynold and Alice wished to come. Reynold answered with a solemn nod. Without further words, the four of them made their way quickly to the teleportation room. The towering iron doors stood open, revealing a flood of weary soldiers stumbling through the glowing gate. Their armor was scarred and bloodied, their weapons still slick with gore. Some clung to comrades for support, others moved in dazed silence, haunted by what they had endured. Arthur's eyes swept across the room until they landed on her, Helen. He nudged his parents, pointing toward the worn figure making her way out of the gate. Even at a distance, it was clear. The leader of the Twin Horns was crushed beneath grief. Reynolds' voice rang out, breaking with emotion as he and Alice rushed to her side. Alice's question trembled in the air before she could finish. Helen's voice was ragged, breaking as she answered. The others were alive. They had been taken to the medical wing. But Adam, her words dissolved, tears spilling down her cheeks before she could say more. Alice and Reynold embraced her tightly, holding her as if to lend strength where there was none left. Helen stepped forward and hugged Arthur tightly. He told her he was glad she had made it and that he was sorry for Adam. The guilt twisted his words. If only he had stayed. If only he had fought beside them longer. But Helen shook her head, her voice cutting him off. She would not let him sink into the same despair. She insisted that no good came of such thoughts. What happened had happened. The only thing that mattered now was how they would make the Alacrians and their twisted beasts pay for it. Alice laid a hand on Helen's shoulder, urging her instead to focus on rest. They would see her to a nurse. Though Helen tried to insist she was fine, her strength gave way under Alice's gentle insistence, and she allowed herself to be led from the room. Arthur stood silently, watching them go. Sylvie's voice stirred in his mind, noting that his parents would soon tell Helen of their choice to rejoin the Twin Horns. Arthur's lips tightened as he answered inwardly. She would be glad to have them back. With Adam gone, the Twin Horns would need all the support they could get, now more than ever. Arthur lingered near the teleportation platform, his eyes fixed on the swirling light of the gate. Minutes dragged like hours as wave after wave of weary, unfamiliar soldiers stumbled out. Their faces unfamiliar, their bodies battered. His chest tightened with each one that wasn't her. Then, at last, a familiar figure emerged. Stannard. Arthur moved without thought, pushing through the crowd to reach him. His hand seized the boy's arm, questions spilling out before he could think. Where was Tessia? Was she safe? Was she with him? His grip tightened unconsciously, enough to draw a wince from Stannard. Arthur released him at once, muttering an apology, though his eyes never strayed far from the gate. He pressed again, asking what had become of the rest of the team. Stannard shook his head, still shaken himself. The Twin Horns had taken the injured to safety after reaching the base, but beyond that, everything had descended into chaos. He didn't know. Arthur's gaze swept the crowd until it landed on Korea. She staggered forward, her body marked by wounds, yet she bore the unconscious weight of Darvis on her back. Without hesitation, Arthur rushed to her side, lifting Darvis easily from her shoulders. Korea gave him a faint, tired thanks, her voice worn with exhaustion. Arthur guided her towards Stannard, pressing a pitcher of water into her hands as they passed a servant. His voice dropped low, urgent. He demanded to know from Korea what had happened to Tessia. Her half-lidded eyes flickered toward him, a weak grin curving her lips. Instead of answering, she simply lifted a trembling hand and pointed behind him. Arthur spun around, and there she was. Tessia hobbled through the portal, her steps heavy, her armor cracked and dented, her hair tangled and streaked with dirt. Arthur's voice broke through her daze, calling her name. She froze, her wide eyes locking on him as if time itself had stopped. It had been 2 long years since she had last seen him. Before she could find the words, Arthur closed the distance in a single stride and pulled her into his arms. His embrace was warm, desperate, filled with the relief he couldn't voice. He whispered his relief against her hair, telling her how glad he was that she was safe. Her answer was gentle, quiet, as if to soothe the storm within him. Of course she was. Arthur drew back slightly, his hand steady on her shoulder. He told her he would take her to her grandfather. Together they walked to Varian's chambers. The old commander's eyes lit with unrestrained emotion the moment he saw her. He rushed forward and squeezed his granddaughter tightly, his arms trembling with the force of his relief. Tessia hadn't been able to spend much time with Arthur after their short reunion. Varian had insisted she undergo medical checks the moment he released her from his embrace. Aside from the deep ache in her bones, she was fine. Relief steadied her heart when she saw her team tended to and safe. That at least had been enough for her. When the healers finished, she returned to her quarters. The The room was just as she had left it, plain, familiar, comforting in its simplicity. For a brief moment, it felt like nothing had changed. She sat gingerly on the bed, her gaze drawn to the photo frame of her and Master Cynthia. A small smile formed in her heart as she stared at it. This at least had stayed the same. Exhaustion pressed her down, pulling her into the sheets, but sleep would not hold her. Hours passed like minutes until she finally gave up. She wondered if her grandfather was still awake, and so she slipped quietly from her room, padding down the corridor to his chambers. It was then that she heard voices from beyond the door. Arthur's voice, hushed but urgent, carried through the wood. He was telling her grandfather that this secret could not be hidden forever, that she would eventually find out. Virian's reply was tense, weary. He argued she wasn't ready, not yet, not in her condition. Arthur pressed harder, his tone sharpened by conviction. She would listen if told directly, but if she were to learn from someone else, what then? Virian's voice cracked, a mixture of anger and fear. What if she chose to go? What then? Arthur's answer came firm, resolute. They would face it then. Both of them knew what Tessia was capable of once her mind was set. Virian's reply snapped like a whip. He couldn't, not after what had happened. His voice broke as he spat his grief. The Vritra had murdered Cynthia in this very castle. What if? The words blurred, drowned beneath the thunder of Tessia's heartbeat. Her body felt weightless, her mind refusing to accept what she had heard. Master Cynthia is dead. No, it was impossible. The woman who had taught her everything, from the careful control of mana to the disciplined flow of swordsmanship, was gone. Their conversation ended. Arthur murmured that he would be in his room and asked Virian to call him when the truth was finally spoken. The door creaked open. Arthur and Virian stepped into the corridor, only to stop cold. Tessia stood there, silent, her gaze lowered to the ground. Her voice trembled, barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of her grief. She asked them to take her to Master Cynthia. The descent was silent, the only sound the echo of their footsteps against the cold stone. Virian led with steady resolve, Tessia following with Arthur close behind. The air grew heavier as they reached the lowest floor of the castle, the dungeons, where criminals and traitors were meant to rot. Tessia's voice finally broke the silence, sharp with disbelief. Why was Master Cynthia being kept here, in a place so filthy and degrading? These cells were for murderers, not for someone who had devoted her life to teaching and protecting others. Virian's tone was steady but tired. This was the most secure place available. When circumstances allowed, Cynthia would be given the farewell she deserved. At the farthest end of the corridor, a single soldier stood guard before a heavy iron door. At Virian's order, the guard swung it open with a shrill screech of metal. Inside, the room was bare except for a flawless stone casket placed at its center. A small, humble pile of flowers rested atop it. Virian explained quietly that only a handful of people even knew of her death. Tessia's words shook as she replied. Cynthia deserved more than this. She deserved her students, her fellow professors, her city to mourn her properly. She deserved a diamond coffin, a countrywide funeral, anything but this lonely hidden cell. Virian placed a hand gently on her back, hoping to soothe her, but the touch only deepened her anger. She shrugged him off, tears rising in her eyes. How could he have kept this from her? If she hadn't overheard, when would he have told her? After the war was over, what else was he hiding from her? Despite all her efforts to prove her maturity, he still treated her as a child. Arthur's voice cut across her grief, sharp and unyielding. He told her plainly that she was still a child. Her head snapped toward him, her face flushed with rage. How could he, of all people, say that? If anyone understood what she was feeling, it should have been him. Yet here he was, dismissing her pain. Arthur's expression hardened into a mask of cold steel. Throwing herself onto the front lines didn't make her mature. Risking her life recklessly to prove herself was no different than a child throwing a tantrum. Virian's voice rose in warning, but Arthur pressed on, his tone unrelenting. If she stopped for a moment to think, she would understand why her grandfather had kept this hidden. What would happen if news spread that even Cynthia Goodsky had been struck down in the very heart of Dicathen, in the one place everyone believed was safest? Arthur's gaze softened, his voice quieter now as he reminded Tessia she was only 17. Her reply came sharp, trembling with emotion, and he was only 16, yet no one, not her grandfather, not Master Alder, not even Master Cynthia, had ever treated him like a child. Why was it different for her? Arthur's answer was hard, unyielding. If others saw him as an adult, it wasn't because he had demanded it. It was something they had come to on their own, not by him recklessly trying to prove it. Virian tried to intervene, his voice edged with warning, but Arthur pressed on, refusing to back down. Tessia needed to hear this. He insisted. Tessia's throat constricted as she fought back a sob. How was any of this fair? Arthur had the freedom to do what he wanted simply because he was strong enough, while no matter what she achieved, no matter how hard she fought, she would always be dismissed, always treated as someone fragile, a burden in need of protection. Arthur's temper broke. His voice erupted, fierce and frustrated, declaring that wasn't what this was about at all, that she was misunderstanding everything. But Tessia cut across him, her voice just as fierce, just as raw. She wasn't his sister. He couldn't expect her to sit quietly, sheltered and hidden away, while everyone else risked their lives. Not everyone he cared about could be locked behind safety. Virian's voice thundered thundered then, silencing them both. Arthur's chest rose and fell sharply, his glare shifting away. He muttered that he had been wrong. She wasn't ready to hear any of this after all. His words hung heavy in the air before he turned sharply on his heel and left. Tessia's eyes remained fixed on the stone floor. She couldn't bear to look at him as he walked away. She didn't know what expression lingered on his face, whether it was anger, guilt, or regret. It didn't matter. The weight of it all was too much. Virian's hand rested gently against her back, his tone softer now. He told her to take this time with him to mourn Cynthia properly. Her mentor would not have cared for a grand ceremony with millions of strangers. She would have wanted the few she cherished most to grieve her here. Tessia managed a shaky nod, whispering her gratitude. Together they turned toward the stone casket. Virian knelt beside her, his hands stroking her trembling shoulders with quiet comfort. He promised her that after this he would tell her everything. Meanwhile, Arthur walked back to his quarters, his thoughts heavy and tangled with frustration. Sylvie padded silently behind him, her eyes watchful. Then, with sudden mischief, she snapped at his leg, her teeth nipping sharply. Arthur jolted, swearing under his breath as he shook his leg violently to dislodge her. Arthur's temper flared. He grabbed Sylvie, lifting her up, his voice sharp as he scolded her. The bite had hurt. Why would she do that? Sylvie's gaze held steady, unimpressed by his anger. She asked him what that entire scene in the dungeon had truly been about. Arthur blinked, taken off guard, but tried to deflect, insisting he hadn't meant anything by it. Sylvie sighed, a quiet weight in the sound. He wasn't being honest. His thoughts had been loud, spilling out for her to hear whether he intended them or not. Arthur bristled, unwilling to admit fault. He told her he had only said what Tessia needed to hear. Sylvie tilted her head at the word, needed. Arthur pressed on, his jaw tight. Tessia had let her emotions cloud her judgment, when what was best for the continent demanded clarity. As a princess and as a soldier, she could not afford to act recklessly. That was why he had spoken, because she needed it. Sylvie's eyes softened with quiet reproach. Tessia's words about Ellie had been wrong, but the truth was harder. Arthur had not been speaking only to her. His frustration with his parents' decision to fight had bled into every word. He had been projecting. Arthur froze, denial clinging to his lips before it faltered. His voice dropped, unsteady as he admitted it might be true. Then he looked at her more directly, demanding honesty. He needed to know what she had truly been training for in Epheotis. Sylvie's mouth curled faintly. Strength, of course, but she added lightly that she had also taken a side course in how best to nag him. Arthur let out a sharp breath, half a laugh, half exhaustion. His eyes lifted to the endless sky above, his voice quieter, touched with longing. He admitted he missed the simpler times. Headmaster Wilbeck's voice was calm but deliberate as she regarded Gray. She admitted she understood his frustration, but confessed she might not be the best person to help. His Kai pool might be small compared to other children his age, but he was still young. There was plenty of time for that to change. Then, with a faint, knowing smile, she offered a lesson broader than just training. When resources were scarce, the wisest course was to save them for the moments that truly mattered. Gray turned her words over in his mind, struggling to pull clarity from their cryptic shape. He nodded slowly, murmuring thanks, uncertain if he understood or not. The headmaster's expression shifted, her tone carrying a lighter weight. Speaking of moments when things mattered most, her voice trailing with meaning. Grace stiffened at the words, only for Wilbeck to chuckle knowingly. She revealed that the orphanage had recently received generous anonymous donations, as though they had appeared from nowhere. Grace stammered, his throat tight, but Wilbeck continued before he could answer. From now on, the orphanage would no longer be accepting donations. The boy jolted upright, alarm flashing across his face. His voice cracked as he asked if that meant the orphanage was closing, but Wilbeck's smile soothed the fear instantly. Not at all. The government had taken an interest in their home and would be funding its operations directly. There would be no more need to worry about money. Surely he understood. Gray forced a nod, though his thoughts raced. Had he and Nico gone too far? Normally such things would have been impossible to keep hidden. But this was Wilbeck, the sorceress they were dealing with. With as much composure as he could muster, he expressed relief and thanked her for telling him. He turned toward the door, eager to escape her piercing gaze. But Wilbeck's voice called him back. Before he left, she asked gently how Cecilia was adjusting with him and Nico. Gray hesitated, then admitted she was slowly opening up to them. Despite her little accidents, there were signs, small but steady, that they were breaking through her guarded shell. Headmaster Wilbeck's sigh carried quiet disappointment as she observed him. She already knew the answer, but voiced it anyway. Cecilia had not spoken to him or Nico even once. Gray could only admit it with a shake of his head. Wilbeck studied him with her calm, steady gaze before telling him she hoped he and Nico would keep trying. If anyone could reach Cecilia, it was the two of them. Gray felt a knot of curiosity forming. There was a reason she was so insistent on this friendship. Why press so hard? The headmaster's lips curved into a gentle smile as she rose from her chair, offering no direct explanation. That story was for Cecilia herself to share one day. Gray scratched at his cheek, his thoughts spilling out. Cecilia looked ordinary enough, but her unpredictable accidents frightened the other children. A few had even ended up in the infirmary because of her. He and Nico weren't afraid, not truly, but it seemed only natural to want to know more about her if they were meant to help. Wilbeck stepped around her desk and rested a hand lightly on his head, tousling his hair with quiet fondness. She told him no matter how much he learned about Cecilia, only Cecilia truly knew herself, and if she didn't yet, she would in time. His role was not to fix her, but to remain by her side as a friend. When the day came that she needed help, she would ask. Until then, friendship was enough. Gray straightened his shoulders with a small salute, addressing her as mother and promising he would remember her words. She narrowed her eyes at his cheeky address, reminding him with a firm tone, though softened by the warmth in her gaze, that she was Headmaster Wilbeck, not mother. Leaving the office, Gray dragged his feet down the corridor, her advice still lingering in his thoughts. But the weight in his chest lifted when laughter erupted nearby. A group of children tore through the hall in a wild chase, their giggles echoing against the walls. Theda, a lively little girl, darted toward him with arms outstretched, declaring him her target. Gray pivoted smoothly, slipping just beyond her grasp. She squealed with delight, calling the others to join her. Soon boys and girls swarmed around him, flailing their arms desperately, trying every trick they knew to tag him. But Gray moved like water, twisting, ducking, weaving through their wild reach with playful ease. Their frantic attempts fell short every time. A grin tugged at his lips as he slipped clear of another lunge, his voice light with laughter. They would have to try harder than that. Theda and her friends finally grew clever, circling around Gray with triumphant cries. Just as her hands reached out, Gray grabbed her in his arms and leapt upward. The children collided into one another in a clumsy heap, wide-eyed at missing their target. Gray landed lightly, laughter bubbling from him as he declared his victory. They were 5 years too young to hope to best the mighty Gray. Odo groaned in defeat, while Theda puffed indignantly, tugging herself out of the tangle of arms and legs. He only deepened his voice, teasing them further. Only weaklings complained about defeat. Then, sweeping a hand grandly, he announced that his heroic powers were needed elsewhere, and darted away, the children's laughter following in his wake. Theda's voice carried after him, cheerful and determined. They would get him next time. Gray slowed his pace as he returned inside, but his steps faltered when he noticed fresh cracks along the floorboards. The house had been deteriorating more quickly than usual. Headmaster Wilbeck was likely too burdened with her many responsibilities to notice. Gray made a mental note to help her with another inspection of the home soon. After making small repairs, he continued to his room. Throwing the door open with theatrical flair, he announced himself. The mighty Gray had arrived. Nico didn't even look up. His voice was flat, distracted as he told him to close the door behind him. Gray's smirk widened when his eyes fell on what Nico was working on. The sight of yarn and cloth in his friend's lap drew a taunting remark about knitting, but when he reached for the glove, Nico's hand shot out, gripping his forearm. A sudden spasm of pain shot through Gray's muscles, sharp and paralyzing. He hissed at the sensation, jerking back as Nico released him. His friend declared that never underestimate the power of knitting. Nico's eyes gleamed with pride as he flexed the glove on his hand. After their encounter with the thugs, he had thrown himself into research, searching for a way to defend himself. He explained his creation with relish. The palm was threaded with microfibers capable of conducting ki, while a small stone embedded in the glove harnessed that energy. When he gripped an opponent, the fibers extended and burrowed, sending paralyzing cramps into their muscles. Gray studied the invention with a mix of amusement and admiration. With a mind like Nico's, it was surprising no family had claimed him yet, but Nico only shrugged, his voice cool. Adoption was nothing to rush into. Parents in his eyes were far from the prize others imagined. Gray had no memories of his own parents, neither good nor bad. Nico, however, carried only hatred for his. It was so deep and absolute that Gray often wondered if in some twisted way he was better off not remembering anything at all. His gaze drifted back to the glove. It was clever, impressive even, but he couldn't help prodding. The glove was fancy, sure. But why not just learn to fight properly, the way he did? Nico shook his head, lips twisting in that familiar smirk. He said that Gray had never actually learned to fight. His body simply reacted, quick and sharp like some primitive predator. Nico didn't have that kind of instinct. His reflexes were closer to a sloth or a turtle, and no amount of training would change that. For him, tools like this glove were survival. Gray conceded with a small grunt, though he pointed out that the invention seemed useful only to buy a little time. Nico nodded easily, admitting the truth, the glove was limited. The microfibers cost a fortune, potion, wore out quickly, and wouldn't hold up in a prolonged fight. He'd already burned through much of their pawned jewelry money just to buy the materials. That brought Gray's mind to another concern. How had Nico managed to get the rest of the money to Headmaster Wilbeck? Nico's answer was smooth. He knew someone who had delivered the donation in their stead, disguised as generosity, with a percentage skimmed in return. Gray's jaw tightened. Between Nico's shopping spree and the percentage taken by this so-called middleman, how much of their stolen money had actually reached the orphanage? Half, if that. Nico only laughed. He hadn't had a choice, he insisted. There was no way Olivia would have accepted money directly from them without suspicion. Gray's patience snapped. He reached over and pinched Nico hard. Nico yelped in pain, thrashing as Gray corrected him sharply. It was Headmaster Wilbeck. Still rubbing his sore arm, Nico groaned, but Gray only crossed his arms and reminded him they wouldn't need to worry about donations anymore. The government was covering the orphanage now. Nico's head perked up instantly, his grin returning with mischievous light. Did that mean he could spend all their tainted money on more microfibers? Gray's glare deepened, his voice dangerously low as he leaned forward. Nico quickly backpedaled, laughing nervously, insisting he was only joking. He fumbled for a distraction, reaching into his things and producing a few books he had picked up with what little was left. Gray flipped through the pages of the book Nico had given him, declaring in mock grandeur that such a magnanimous gentleman would forgive the lame joke from earlier. Nico chuckled under his breath, correcting him with a grin. It's magnanimous. Gray, unable to conjure a sharp retort, let the jab pass in silence. But before he could sink back into the book, the room gave a sudden shudder. The floor trembled beneath their feet, dust drifting down from the ceiling beams. Gray groaned. He didn't even need to finish the thought. Nico had already answered. Another accident. Cecilia again. He said they should go check on her. Gray protested sharply. It was too dangerous. He reminded Nico of the volunteer who had tried to restrain her the last time. The man had been built like a bear, yet he hadn't even been able to approach before being flung aside. Nico's jaw tightened. He hated waiting, hated standing by helplessly until Cecilia's body burned itself out and she collapsed. Gray caught the flicker in his friend's eyes, the concern that went beyond irritation. He leaned in, voice teasing but edged with curiosity. He liked her. Color bloomed faintly on Nico's cheeks. He snapped back a denial, insisting he didn't even know her. Gray only smiled, letting the silence stretch. Nico twitched under the weight of it before admitting, grudgingly, that maybe he thought she was a little pretty. Gray's smirk widened. Sure. The teasing ended when the walls shook harder. Plaster cracked and fell, scattering across the floor as the tremors deepened. Gray and Nico sprinted down the hallway, veering left at the end until they reached Cecilia's room. The iron door rattled in its frame, and a cluster of adult volunteers stood outside, tense but unmoving. Nico scowled, demanding why they were just standing there doing nothing. Gray didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the trembling door. In one sharp motion, he snatched the glove from Nico's hand before his friend could react. Nico shouted after him in alarm, but Gray was already moving. His thoughts sharpened into resolve. The intensity of this episode would keep Randall, their strongest volunteer, from ever reaching Cecilia in time. The door heaved open, and Gray bolted forward, zipping past Randall's shoulder. The moment he stepped into the room, instinct screamed. He twisted to the side just as an unseen force tore past him, the impact catching Randall square in the chest and sending the man crashing into the stone wall of the corridor. Cecilia was unlike any other child who practiced Kai. While even the most gifted users could barely stir a breeze with their energy, she was different. An irregularity. She could wrap herself in torrents of raw Kai, but had no control over it. According to the headmaster, the slightest emotional spark could set her power spiraling out of control. Many would see such strength as a blessing, but looking at her, a child trembling beneath the weight of her own energy, Gray could only see it as a curse. Bracing himself, he dashed toward the center of the wide room where Cecilia writhed on the ground, her body convulsing. The moment her wide eyes found him, panic flared in her expression. Instinct alone kept him alive. Blasts of Kai erupted outward like invisible blades, forcing him to twist and crawl, every dodge a breath away from disaster. One strike would be enough to snap bones and leave him unconscious, if not worse. Cold sweat streaked down his temple as he darted, his movements reduced to a frantic, deadly game of tag with a force he could neither see nor predict. Her voice cracked through the chaos, desperate and breaking, warning him away, that he would only be hurt. But Gray pressed forward, swallowing the urge to shout back. His arm throbbed painfully, but he ignored it, crawling closer until he was within reach, praying his idea would work. With one final stretch, his fingers closed around Cecilia's trembling hand. The glove pulsed, its fibers extending, binding, pulling her torrent into stillness. A pained gasp tore from her lips, her almond-shaped eyes wide with shock before sliding shut. Strands of blonde hair fell over her flushed face as her skin slowly returned to its soft, pale hue. Gray tried to rise, but his body refused. His ki had been drained beyond its limits, leaving his limbs heavy and unresponsive. His last conscious thought was bitter, that he was too weak, too pitiful, before the dark pull of exhaustion dragged him under beside her, and then the memory dissolved. An unfamiliar voice broke through the remnants of the dream, dragging Arthur back toward the present. The handmaid's urgent knocking rattled the door as she pleaded for Arthur to wake. Commander Varian's speech was drawing near, and he had to be bathed and prepared. Before she could continue, a deeper voice sounded from outside, impatient, edged with disdain, followed by the sharp crackle of energy. A sudden blast of lightning shattered the door, jolting Arthur violently awake. He reacted on instinct, springing to his feet and catching the crackling projectile in his hand before it could strike. His eyes narrowed as he recognized Baron, standing in the doorway with his arm still outstretched. The lance's expression held little warmth, only a cold appraisal of Arthur's reflexes. Arthur's thoughts seethed at the dishonor of being attacked from behind, but Baron's presence was a grim reminder that war left no room for such ideals. The lance's curt demand was clear. Arthur was to change immediately, as the others were already assembled at the teleportation gate. Without waiting for acknowledgement, Baron turned and left, his movements taut with restrained electricity. Arthur let out a slow breath as the tension drained from his shoulders. After Lucas, he and Baron had always been at odds, their differences unavoidable. Yet now, in the shadow of war, rivalry and pride meant nothing. Both were lances, both essential. Their personal quarrels dissolved before the greater weight of their continent's survival. The timid handmaid crept cautiously into the room, her voice carrying a nervous tremor as she repeated her request to prepare him. Before Arthur could respond, another woman entered, larger, firmer in presence, her steps heavy against the floor. She swept past the timid maid, declaring with certainty that she had Varian's approval to ensure Arthur was made ready. With an unsettling confidence, she even suggested that if he was unwilling or incapable of washing himself, she would see to it personally. Arthur recoiled instinctively, making it clear he had no need for such help. The bulky maid, satisfied, laid out the set of armor Lord Alder had arranged for him to wear for the speech. Elsewhere within the castle, Priscilla busied herself with adjusting her husband's collar, her touch gentle yet purposeful as she tried to ease his tension, but Blaine's unease weighed heavily upon him. The looming Alacrian threat was pressing closer to their shores, and he could not understand why Commander Varian had chosen Atiston as the stage for his speech. Priscilla's own thoughts mirrored his, doubt clouding her composure. The irony was sharp. This was the very danger that had once driven them from their castle, and now it lingered even closer as they awaited Varian's words. Their hushed conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another presence, a voice cutting through with calm certainty. Alduin, King of Elenoir, observed that Varian's decision to hold the speech in Etistain was deliberate. It was not recklessness, but strategy. By standing on the western shore, within reach of danger, Varian hoped to inspire the masses, to show that their forces were more formidable up close than the distant sight of Alacrian ships creeping across the horizon. Marielle, regal at her husband's side, added that with all the lances gathered together behind them, watching from above like guardians of the skies, the commander would achieve precisely the reaction he intended. Blaine's tone, however, remained heavy. His concern was not the display itself, but the reality looming behind it. The possibility that the true beginning of this war was closer than any of them wanted to admit. Their exchange quieted when Varian turned, his sharp eyes falling on Arthur. Approval flickered across his stern face as he regarded the young lance's freshly donned armor. Arthur offered the commander a respectful bow before acknowledging the kings and queens gathered there. To Alduin and Marielle, he gave the courtesy of recognition, noting how long it had been since they had last met. To Blaine and Priscilla, he offered a deeper bow, polite yet constrained by the steel of his armor. Marielle's gaze softened at the sight of him, quietly acknowledging how much he had grown. Arthur accepted the remark with tempered humility, knowing that age brought with it both stature and responsibility. Blaine, however, looked at him with sharper purpose, weighing him not only as a boy who had matured, but as one of his best soldiers. Strength was what he would require. Arthur, in turn, set aside roots and race, recognizing only the continent itself as the cause he served. A new figure stepped forward then, drawing Arthur's attention. The elderly dwarf bore the bearing of long experience, his presence commanding but measured. He introduced himself as Radaeus, the new delegate of the dwarves. His eyes were steady as he explained that he had heard of Arthur through Elijah's letters. Arthur clasped the dwarf's hand firmly, realization dawning. Radaeus was not merely a delegate, he had been Elijah's guardian since infancy. A pang of guilt cut through Arthur as he lowered his gaze. His voice was heavy as he admitted his sorrow for not arriving in time to protect his friend. But Radaeus only shook his head, resignation etched deep into his lined features. He said that Elijah had always been a magnet for trouble, his path shaped by storms that no guardian could have fully shielded him from. Arthur clasped Radaeus' hand firmly in both of his, locking his gaze onto the dwarf's weathered eyes. In that moment, his vow was clear. If Elijah still lived, he would bring him back. The old dwarf whispered his thanks as he released Arthur's grip, his hands fragile now, despite the strength they once carried. Varian broke the silence, formally acknowledging Radaeus as the new delegate for the dwarves before turning his attention to the gathering. gathering. He explained that they would go on ahead, the gatekeeper ready to signal the others when the time came to follow. Arthur's thoughts lingered on the dwarf. He wished there had been more time to spend with Radaeus, to learn what Elijah had been like as a child, guided by the man who had raised him. Even Sylvie's voice touched his mind, wondering how Elijah had ended up in Darv, raised by someone of such standing and yet carried so far into hardship. A light tap drew Arthur's attention away. Turning, he found himself face to face with the elven lance known as Phantasm. Aya Greffen carried herself with deliberate poise, her wavy black hair tucked elegantly behind her ear as she offered her hand with a coy smile. Her expectation was clear, but Arthur chose differently, grasping her hand in a firm shake instead of the courtly gesture she seemed to await. Aya's smile did not falter, though her eyes sharpened as she withdrew, swaying confidently back to her place. Sylvie's soft thoughts brushed against him, remarking that Aya seemed pleasant, but Arthur disagreed. Her aura betrayed a far colder nature than her charm allowed. Nearby, Vare, who had been watching him in silence, finally spoke. Her sharp eyes assessed him with the precision of a blade. She observed that his training had borne fruit, his mana having crossed from the initiate silver stage into mid-silver. Arthur admitted to himself that the road ahead was still long if he intended to reach the white stage, but Vare's expression suggested otherwise. To her, the distance between those thresholds was not as vast as he believed. Before the exchange could continue, the gatekeeper stirred with sudden urgency. A signal had been received. His voice rang out, commanding the gathered lances to step forward. The gate was ready. Baron strode confidently toward the teleportation gate, his presence commanding as always. Arthur gestured for Aya and Vare to move ahead of him, watching as the curvy elf tossed him a teasing wink while swaying past, her steps deliberate and playful. Vare, by contrast, was stoic, her sharp gaze unwavering as she passed without a word. When Arthur finally stepped through the gate, the world dissolved into a blur of shifting light and sound. On the other side, a sudden roar of noise struck him like a wave, forcing a wince from his lips. The floor beneath him trembled with the force of it. They had arrived in a vast rectangular hall that opened onto a sweeping balcony. From its edge, Virion stood tall alongside the kings and queens, all of them raising their hands to the sea of people below. Tess, Curtis, and Kathleen were there as well, their youthful faces bright as they waved enthusiastically to the masses. Even from where Arthur stood, the sight of the immense crowd stretched endlessly, a living ocean of voices and raised arms. For a moment, Arthur's thoughts drifted inward. It had been so long since he had stood before a crowd this large, feeling the weight of their expectation pressing against him like a physical force. A thin handmaid rushed forward, reminding the gathered to prepare themselves. She addressed them as generals, a title that caught Arthur off guard, though there was no time to dwell on it. The cheers softened as Virion began to speak, his voice carrying effortlessly across the multitudes. The commander's words were heavy with pride and conviction, honoring the sacrifices of leaders and warriors alike. Yet he made clear that the ones who bore the greatest burden were not the kings or queens, but the lances, their fiercest protectors who stood always on the front lines. At his signal, the crowd erupted into chants, their voices weaving into a single thunderous rhythm for lances. The chant surged and rolled like a storm until Virion raised his hand. Silence fell immediately, the sudden stillness almost as deafening as the roar had been. His next words struck like iron, reminding the people of the reality they faced. This was a time of war. Half of the lances were already absent, not through neglect, but because they fought even now at the edges of the battlefield. Virion declared that the title of lance was never bound to birthright or privilege. It was a mantle earned only through strength, talent, and unyielding effort. And now he proclaimed a new era was beginning. A new protector had risen to stand among them. At those words, every eye turned toward Arthur. The assembled lances and the gathered royals all shifted their gaze to him as he moved toward the balcony's edge. The sound of the crowd rose once more, swelling into a deafening crescendo that shook the very air. At the farthest point of the balcony, Virion stood waiting, his gaze fixed on the sea of people. Arthur approached with quiet unease, his voice dropping low as he questioned whether this display had been Virion's doing. The old commander's faint grin was answer enough as he subtly urged Arthur forward, the weight of the crowd's eyes pressing against them. Had it been anyone else orchestrating this, Arthur might have bristled with anger. Virion wanted this moment, not for himself, but for the people. With a wry expression, he reminded Arthur to keep smiling and waving, for the crowd below was not only watching in person, but also through a vast projection cast behind them. Then, with a glint of mischief, Virion asked the unthinkable, whether Arthur had prepared a speech for the occasion. Arthur's heart stumbled in his chest. The thought of standing before countless thousands, carrying words he hadn't even considered, left him momentarily paralyzed. He wasn't ready for this. Not for the title, not for the expectations, and certainly not for a speech. Yet Virion had intended it this way. The people didn't need polished words rehearsed by nobles. They needed honesty. They needed someone who had lived as they did, who carried the same scars, the same fears, someone who could speak from the heart. With that, Virion stepped back, leaving Arthur alone before the world, as the crowd's cheers ebbed into a restless silence. For a moment, Arthur's resolve wavered. Then, across the mass mass of bodies below, his eyes found his mother. Even with the aid of his augmented vision, her features were blurred by distance, yet the warmth of her smile cut through the storm. That single gentle look was enough. The fear in his chest loosened, replaced by a quiet certainty. He knew what to say. A low buzz resonated in the air as the artifact was activated, signaling that his voice would now carry across the city. Arthur stepped closer to the balcony rail, placing his hands upon it as the swell of cheers reignited, only to die down again in expectant silence. He began by addressing the people of Dicathen, thanking them for gathering in such a time of uncertainty. Though still young, he admitted to having pored over countless books on history and economy, all of which speculated on what bound a citizen to their homeland. Some scholars argued that loyalty stemmed from a natural inclination to one's birthplace. Others claimed it was a structured chain of security, beginning with rulers providing for their people, parents caring for their children, and so forth. But Arthur disagreed. To him, loyalty was not something that could be bought, inherited, or imposed by rulers. It was not a calculation, nor a matter of birthright. True loyalty was born from freedom of choice, nourished through bonds between friends, neighbors, and even strangers, strengthened by the promise to protect and progress together. Perhaps it was presumptuous to define it, for each person carried their own understanding of loyalty in their hearts, showing it in their own way. Yet one truth remained. Loyalty was easy in times of comfort. It was easy to praise a king when children were fed and lands were prosperous. It was easy to rally behind an army when victory seemed assured. But war changed everything. This war would test every citizen's resolve. They might be faced with the choice of dying with their people or surviving by surrendering to their enemies. Arthur declared his choice. It was not the title of lance that compelled his loyalty, nor was it duty alone. His loyalty to Dicathen had not been bought nor freely given. It had been nurtured through his life in this continent. It had been shaped in the quiet countryside of his childhood, forged through his years as an adventurer, refined as a student, and strengthened as a teacher. Now, as a lance, it would be proven. Dicathen was not perfect. Its rulers had their flaws, but no one could deny that the three kingdoms had tried. Only a few generations ago, the formation of the council would have been unthinkable. Yet leaders from all three races had set aside their pride to unite, sharing resources to better the lives of all who lived here. Prejudices still lingered, but the continent belonged to all of them. It was their shared home. Beyond that very city, however, an army approached. Over 100 Alacrian ships were closing in on their shores. Their enemies had offered a choice: surrender the royal families or face devastation on a far greater scale. Varian himself had been ready to sacrifice his life if it meant sparing the people, but Arthur's hope was different. He would rather fight and risk dying for the life he had come to cherish here than place his faith in an empty promise that their enemies might never keep. Still, he knew the choice was not his alone to make. He would not speak for every soul in Dicathen. The decision lay with its people. Arthur's final words rang out with unwavering conviction. Every soul standing upon that balcony would fight to their last breath to defend Dicathen from those who dared invade it. For a moment, the world held its breath. The silence stretched endlessly, heavy and expectant, until at last a single voice cut through the stillness. Long live Dicathen! The call was like a spark to tinder. In an instant, the crowd ignited, their chant rolling across the city in perfect unison, shaking the ground and reverberating through the very stones of the castle. Arthur deactivated the voice-amplifying artifact, drawing in a long, steadying breath. His shoulders eased slightly as Sylvie hopped down from her perch, the roar of the crowd still swelling around them. Then, with dramatic timing only she could manage, his bond shifted. Her small, pearly form dissolved into that of an immense dragon, scales gleaming black as night. The balcony trembled beneath her colossal wingspan. Winds howled as she beat her wings, sending powerful gales surging through the masses below. Then came her roar, deep, thunderous, and absolute. It swallowed every other sound, echoing through stone and sky alike, commanding both awe and fear from all who heard it. The crowd's response was immediate. Their cheers rose even higher. Their chant transformed into an anthem, fueled by the spectacle of dragon and lance united. For that moment, Dicathen stood as one, defiant and unbroken. When the roar faded, Sylvie folded her wings, her massive form shimmering before shrinking once more into her familiar fox-like pup. She leapt gracefully back onto Arthur's shoulder, her pride radiating through their bond. He felt the smug note in her thoughts, and despite himself, a faint smile tugged at his lips. She had indeed made their message impossible to ignore. After the speech, Curtis approached, his face bright with excitement. He praised Arthur's closing display, his words tumbling out as he admitted he had already heard rumors about Sylvie's true form. To see it with his own eyes left him awestruck. Kathleen, calm as always, stood at his side and asked if Arthur would be attending the noble's reception in the city. He shook his head, answering simply that another event awaited him. Moments later, Arthur rejoined his family and the surviving members of the Twin Horns. Together, they gathered before the simple grave that now held Adam's name. The air was heavy, filled with a quiet grief that needed no words. Reynolds stepped forward first, his expression a mixture of sorrow and pride. He recalled aloud the memory of Adam helping to save his family from bandits long before Eleanor was even born. He remembered how it felt to fight beside him again after so many years, how Adam still seemed unchanged at first glance, aggressive, impulsive, brash, yet undeniably genuine, ambitious, and fiercely loyal. But in truth, he realized he had been wrong. Time had changed Adam. He had grown, not just as a fighter, but as a protector, as a friend. Reynolds' voice grew steadier as he spoke of how Adam's ambitions would never rest, even now. He imagined his old comrade continuing his pursuit of strength and passion beyond the limits of this world, never able to sit still. And he believed Adam would want the same for those left behind, to keep striving, to keep living. With reverent care, Reynolds laid a flower upon the grave, his final words carrying the weight of both farewell and promise. He wished Adam rest until the day they might meet again. A hush fell over the group as they bowed their heads in shared mourning. Helen finally broke it, her voice quiet as she thanked Arthur for coming. Durden followed, offering his congratulations on Arthur's new position as a lance, though he admitted with regret that he had not been there to witness the speech. Arthur thanked them softly, his words carrying the weight of sincerity. Angela stepped forward and pulled him into a warm embrace, her voice steady with pride as she told him that all of them were proud of what he had become. As Arthur drew back, his gaze swept the quiet gathering, and that was when he noticed a familiar presence watching from the edge of the shadows. Varian stepped forward, his expression as unreadable as ever. Arthur remarked that he hadn't needed to forgo the noble reception in Dicathen. Allowing the funeral to be held here had already been more than enough, but Varian shook his head, saying he had chosen to come. The nobles, he reasoned, could manage without him for an evening. The kings and queens of the continent were already in attendance. His absence would not be missed. Arthur, struck by the thought, acknowledged quietly that Adam would have appreciated such a gesture. For a moment, silence hung between them. Then Varian reached inside his robe, his movements slow and deliberate. He admitted the timing was poor, but there was something Arthur needed to consider without delay. From the folds of his robe, he produced a coin of black stone, no larger than his palm. Its surface shimmered faintly as he held it out. Arthur's eyes narrowed in recognition. It was Alea's artifact, the token carried by every lance. Varian explained that after Alea's death, King Alduin had returned the relic to him. Bound by blood, the artifact would grant Arthur the same surge of strength that had pushed every other lance into the white stage. Varian's voice was steady, but the respect beneath it was clear as he said it would be his honor if Arthur accepted the bond and stood as a lance under his command. Arthur lowered his gaze, the weight of the offer heavy in his chest. He admitted he would fight for Varian regardless, even without such a bond, and though he might one day regret the decision, he could not accept it. He didn't want his path to the white stage forged by aid or shortcuts. He would reach it on his own. From the shadows, another voice emerged. Alder stepped into the dim light, his single violet eye fixed on Arthur. Though he noted it might not be his place to speak, he said plainly that he agreed with Arthur's choice. Arthur's gaze flicked toward Alder, his tone edged with wry suspicion as he asked if the Asura had been standing in the shadows the entire time. Alder admitted it without hesitation. After all, that was his role. His voice, calm and measured, explained what Arthur had already suspected. The artifact Varian offered was powerful, capable of granting a tremendous boost in strength, yet such power came at a cost. It would lock away the potential for further growth. For most, Alder would recommend using it, especially in times as perilous as these. But Arthur was not most. His bond with Sylvie, the dragon blood that coursed through his veins, and the lingering will of her mother within his core made him an exception. What seemed a disadvantage now could, if he survived, become his greatest advantage. Arthur's reply was quiet but steady. He could only hope that such a future came soon. Varian's expression hardened as he posed the question that lingered over them all. Was Arthur ready for this war? Arthur answered with honesty. He wasn't, but he had no intention of losing to the Vritra. Aldir's lips curved into the faintest smile at that, satisfaction glinting in his lone eye as he said it was precisely the response he had wanted to hear. The two elders returned toward the castle, leaving Arthur behind to face another farewell. His parents stood waiting, resolute in their decision to rejoin the Twin Horns. He tried to persuade them to stay away from the western shores where the battle would be thickest, but they remained firm. Their determination mirrored the weight of a lifetime spent in this land. Arthur's frustration was heavy, but beneath it lay understanding. He knew his perspective was shaped by memories of another world, another life. Dicathen was his home because his family was here, but for them, for Reynold and Alice, this land itself was their home. Protecting it was not simply a choice, but an instinct. He thought of death then, its shadow looming over them all. They say one only truly understands death after it has claimed someone beloved. Yet Arthur had come to learn another truth. Every death should serve as a reminder, a call to protect the living, to hold fiercely to those still here. When his parents finally departed, Arthur removed the last pieces of his armor and collapsed into his chair with a weary sigh. Regret pressed against his chest, sharp and bitter. bitter. Parting with them in argument had not been the farewell he wished for. Sylvie's voice touched his mind gently, breaking the silence. She told him what he already knew, that leaving things unresolved, especially now, weighed heavier than it should. Frustration gnawed at Arthur as he sat hunched forward, his thoughts circling restlessly. Every time it felt like they were finally making progress, something forced them 2 steps back. His parents' decision weighed on him the most. Why wouldn't they listen? He hadn't said anything wrong, yet his words had been dismissed, almost as if his concern carried no weight. Sylvie's quiet presence pressed against his mind, her thoughts slipping through like ripples on still water. To them, what he had said might as well have been telling them to hide away in some far-off corner of the world. Arthur bristled, denying it, but deep down, he knew she was right. His worry hadn't been for the war, or strategy, or the continent. It had been for his family. He was grateful Ellie would remain behind, safe, but that did not mean his parents should walk willingly into danger. His heart cried out not as a soldier, but as their son. Sylvie understood, yet she reminded him that from their perspective, discerning the difference between Arthur the son and Arthur the reincarnated warrior was never simple. They were doing the best they could, just as he was. Arthur's gaze softened as he turned his thoughts to her. When had she first known the truth about what he was? Sylvie's answer came without hesitation. She had always known. Perhaps not at first with the clarity she carried now, but she had been listening to his thoughts since the moment of her birth. The revelation hit him hard. Every thought? His mind recoiled in horror as he realized what that meant. She explained it with teasing calm, reminding him that though she heard everything, she only chose to respond when he directed his words toward her. For her, it was much like speaking aloud, though she had learned to keep her own thoughts hidden. He, on the other hand, had never mastered such restraint. Arthur's eyes widened as the implications dawned on him, but Sylvie's grin confirmed it. She knew every fleeting thought, every moment of turmoil, even the tangled emotions he tried to bury whenever Tessia crossed his mind. He groaned, mortified, but Sylvie only comforted him further. She had grown used to the flood of his thoughts over the years. Though she teased, her grin softened, and behind the sharp teeth was reassurance. She had seen all of him and remained by his side. Arthur grumbled that he hadn't grown used to anything at all, but Sylvie's grin faded as her bright yellow eyes fixed on him with uncharacteristic gravity. She reminded him of what her grandfather had told her during training, that although she was far from reaching the level of a true Asura, his blood still flowed within her veins. It gave her strength enough to fight beside Arthur in the coming war, but not invincibility. The only way either of them would survive was by relying on one another. Arthur nodded in agreement, though confusion stirred beneath his calm. Something about the tone in her voice unsettled him. This wasn't Sylvie's usual playful confidence. She confessed then, her voice quieter, that there were things she had hidden, things she had only recently discovered, and that he was the only one she trusted with her life. Arthur softened immediately, assuring her that she had no reason to doubt him. He had raised her since the day she was born, and she could trust him with anything. Sylvie seemed to ease at his words, hopping down from the armrest onto his seat and resting her head against his lap. It struck Arthur then how unusual this was. For the first time, Sylvie had openly expressed fear for her own life. If the war had unsettled her to this extent, then perhaps even she felt the weight of what was coming. He ran a gentle hand over her soft fur, lost in thought. He teased her lightly, remarking on how clever she had become since their return from Ephiodus, her intelligence growing just as quickly as her pride. Sylvie, half asleep already, murmured that she had always been a fast learner, that sitting atop his head all the time had been her way of observing and absorbing the world around them. It helped that Arthur knew so much, and that his unguarded thoughts were always open to her. With that, she nestled closer against his leg, her breathing steadying as sleep began to claim her. Arthur leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling while his hand continued to stroke her head. She was right to be concerned. If Winsome's words had been true, then the ships nearing Dicathen's shores carried horrors beyond ordinary soldiers. At Grona's experiments, humans infused with Asura blood. The thought weighed heavily on him. Just then, a voice called his name, low and hoarse, cutting through the silence of his room. The gravelly baritone snapped him from his spiraling reflections. His head turned, irritation flickering across his face at the sight of the intruder. There was no knock, no courtesy, not even the faintest regard for privacy. He muttered that there ought to be some etiquette about entering another's room. Alder, unbothered, replied calmly that Arthur's tone told him enough, that whatever business he had just concluded had not gone well. He explained that Lord Indrath himself had told him to rely on Arthur's judgment throughout the war. After witnessing the speech Arthur had given earlier, Alder confessed he understood why. Arthur's role should not be limited to swinging a sword. When he wasn't absolutely needed on the battlefield, he would stand at Alder's side within the council. Arthur blinked, the corners of his mouth tightening in disbelief. 16 years old, and already he was expected to make decisions that could alter the course of nations. It felt absurd, yet Alder pressed on, dismissing his doubts. Arthur might be a lesser by blood, but he was no ordinary teenager. There would be moments when his voice was needed, though Alder had no intention of wasting his talents listening to endless political squabbles. He had other plans for him. Arthur's gaze narrowed, shifting the weight of the conversation back toward the Asura. He asked if it wasn't frustrating to be restrained, knowing how much devastation Aldir alone could bring to their enemies. The Asura's expression hardened, but there was something else beneath it. He said that his time would come. This battle would mark the dawn of a new era. If Dicathen could endure, if it stood alongside the Asuras, then Agrona and his clan of traitors would fall, and a new continent would lie within their reach. Arthur studied him in silence before finally speaking, his tone sharpened by intuition. Aldir had lost someone to Agrona. The brief pause that followed confirmed it, though Aldir only gave a simple truth. Many had. Arthur did not soften his words. He had no intention of losing this war, but if Aldir truly wanted his help, then trust was non-negotiable. Any advice Arthur gave needed to be taken seriously, and if the Lessers were going to fight the battles of Asuras, then the least Aldir could do was treat them with respect. The Asura regarded him carefully, then inclined his head. Arthur was asking much, but Aldir agreed. Still, even as he accepted the correction, the word slipped, and he admitted it worried him whenever he left the Lessers. He corrected himself with a faint hesitation. People alone for too long. Arthur gave a small nod, agreeing to join him shortly in the meeting room, but a lingering question tugged at his mind. He asked about the two absent lances who had not been present that day. 2 years ago, Aldir had said they were working under him, but Arthur couldn't help his suspicion. The Asura didn't take offense. He shook his head slowly. Even he wouldn't be so reckless as to kill a lance outright. While political envoys could be replaced, the power of a lance was far rarer. It could take years to nurture, even for those with high compatibility to the artifact. He explained that he intended to bring the matter up in the council meeting, but since Arthur had raised it, he was interested in hearing his perspective. Arthur listened carefully, then after a moment of silence, a sly grin spread across his face. His mind had already leapt ahead, weaving a sharper, bolder alternative. What the Asura proposed wasn't bad, but Arthur had a better idea. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Until next time, happy watching!